child's cough started 3 days ago. Now she's drowning in air that's turned to poison. Her mother holds her close, both their faces covered in ash-soaked rags, but it's not enough. Nothing is enough anymore. Outside their cave, the world has gone dark at noon. Not from clouds, but from the mountain that exploded 2,000 miles away and murdered the sun. 74,000 years ago, while you're watching this video in your warm home with your next meal guaranteed, your ancestors were dying. Not some of them, 90% of them. In the next 72 hours, this little girl will either become one of the fewer than 10,000 humans left alive on planet Earth, or she'll join the mountains of corpses already frozen in the endless volcanic winter. But here's what should terrify you. She's your great-great-grandmother, multiplied by 3,000 generations. If she dies, you're never born. None of us are. The entire human race, 8 billion people today, hangs by a thread so thin that a single child's next breath could snap it. This is the story of how a supervolcano turned Earth into an alien planet, how the sky bled ash for years, how plants died, animals vanished, and humans were hunted by their own starvation. This is the story of the Toba Winter, when our entire species came within a handful of heartbeats of total extinction. And the only reason you exist to watch this, because that dying child and her mother were about to discover something in the next desperate hours that would change everything. Something so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it would save not just their lives, but yours too. The mountain had 74,000 years to kill us. It almost succeeded. Almost. The antelope was perfectly positioned. After 3 days of tracking, Kuda's band had finally cornered the herd against the cliff face. His daughter, barely 13 summers old, gripped her first real spear. Today, she would become a hunter. Today, she would feed her people. Then the ground screamed. Not a rumble, not a shake. A scream that came from the center of the earth itself. So deep, it bypassed the ears and went straight to the bones. Birds exploded from trees in clouds so thick they darkened the morning sun. The antelope forgot their terror of humans and bolted past the hunters close enough to touch, their eyes white with a fear that transcended species. Kuda's daughter dropped her spear. "Father, what?" The mountain exploded. 2,000 miles away, in what would one day be called Sumatra, Toba had awakened. But Kuda didn't know about Toba, didn't know about supervolcanoes or pyroclastic flows or volcanic winters. All he knew was that the northern horizon had transformed into a pillar of fire that connected earth to sky, and the world his grandfather's grandfather had known was ending. The sound arrived 40 minutes later. When modern Americans think of loud, they think of rock concerts at 115 decibels, maybe a gunshot at 1400. The Toba eruption hit 310 decibels at source, loud enough to rupture organs, to turn sound itself into a weapon. By the time it reached Kuda's band in East Africa, it had weakened to merely deafening. Children screamed, adults clutched their heads, blood trickled from ears. But the sound was just the herald, the real killer was coming. Within hours, the sky began to darken. Not clouds, this was different. This was the sun itself being eaten, bite by something hungry and grey. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, then 20. Ash began to fall like snow that burned the tongue and clogged the throat. Kuda had lived through droughts, through floods, through lions and diseases that killed half the children before they could walk. But this was the mountain spirits themselves declaring war on everything that breathed. The ash fell heavier, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world painted in grey death. His band numbered 37 souls, extended family mostly, 3 nursing mothers, 8 children who couldn't yet throw a spear, 4 elders who remembered the last time the earth shook, though nothing like this. They looked to him for answers, and Kuda had none. Except one, the cave, their winter shelter, 2 days' walk toward the coast. If they could reach it before. A child coughed, then another. The ash was finding its way into lungs, coating throats, turning breath itself into labor. Kuda's daughter tried to speak but produced only a grey-tinted wheeze. The very air had become their enemy. "Cover your faces," he commanded, tearing strips from his hide wrap. "Breathe through cloth. Stay close. We move for the cave." They'd prepared for predators, for rival bands, for hunger and thirst and the 100 other deaths that stalked their world. But how do you prepare for the sky to fall? How do you fight an enemy that comes as air itself? As they began their desperate march toward shelter, Kuda couldn't know that 90% of his species would be dead within a decade. Couldn't know that the few who survived would carry this trauma in their very DNA, a bottleneck written in genes that every human today still carries. All he knew was that the world had ended, and somehow, impossibly, they were still alive. For now, the first night was almost normal. Almost. If you ignored the taste of ash on every breath, the way the stars seemed dimmer, how the children wouldn't stop crying about the burning in their throats. Kuda's band had made good time, covering half the distance to the cave before darkness forced them to stop. "Tomorrow will be better," old Naya whispered, cradling her grandson. "The mountain will sleep again. The sun will return." She was wrong. Kuda woke to a world without dawn. Where sunrise should have painted the eastern sky, there was only a sick, grey twilight. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale ghost of itself, a dim orange ball you could stare at without blinking. And the ash fell heavier than yesterday. "Papa, I can't see the path," his daughter wheezed. She was right. The familiar landmarks were vanishing under a blanket of grey death. The baobab tree where they'd gathered water last season was now a skeletal shadow. The stream they'd planned to follow was a sluggish trickle of mud. And the ash kept falling. By midday, though, who could tell anymore, they'd covered less than 5 miles. Half what they needed. The nursing mothers were struggling, their babies refusing milk that tasted of sulfur and smoke. The elderly moved like the walking dead, each step an agony of will. Then they found the first bodies. Another band, maybe 20 strong, scattered along what had been a game trail, dead less than a day, their faces grey masks of suffocation. Children curled against parents who could no longer protect them. Strong hunters reduced to ash-covered corpses. "Don't look," Kuda commanded, but it was too late. His people had seen their future. "We should take their water gourds," someone suggested. Practical, necessary, horrifying. They did. As they pilfered from the dead, Kuda noticed something that chilled him more than the corpses. Animal tracks, or rather the absence of them. No antelope prints, no lion spoor, no bird calls. The world wasn't just dying, it was emptying. The darkness deepened as they traveled. Not night darkness, but something altogether worse. A perpetual twilight that turned noon to dusk and dusk to blindness. The ash cloud was thickening, rising miles into the sky, spreading across the world like a cancer of shadow. "The ancestors are angry," muttered Yuki, one of the hunters. "We've offended them. This is punishment." "Then why punish the children?" Kuda snapped, immediately regretting his sharpness. Fear was making them all brittle. "Save your breath for walking." But privately, he wondered. Every culture had stories of the world's end. His grandmother had spoken of a time when the sky burned and the good people were taken to live with the spirits. Was this that time? Were they the ones left behind? By late afternoon, or what passed for it in this eternal grey, they reached the hills that marked the final approach to their cave. Hope flickered. Just 5 more miles. They could make it before true darkness fell. Then the wind changed. It came from the north, carrying with it a fresh wave of ash, so thick it was like walking through grey water. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Children disappeared in the murk, their cries muffled by the suffocating air. The band compressed, holding on to each other, a human chain fighting through apocalypse. "The cave," someone shouted. "I see the cave." They stumbled forward, hope driving exhausted legs. But as they drew closer, Kuda's heart sank. Dark shapes moved near the entrance. Others had found their shelter first, many others. 3 bands had already claimed the cave. Maybe 60 people crammed into a space meant for 30. Suspicious eyes watched as Kuda's group approached. Hands moved to spears. "There's no room," the largest man stated, not a question. A fact backed by desperation. Kuda counted his people, counted theirs, calculated odds he didn't like. His band had children, elderly, exhausted adults. The cave dwellers were mostly young adults, strong, federal, rested. "We have children," he tried, "babies who won't survive the night outside." "So do we." No sympathy. Survival had already begun its ugly mathematics. That's when Kuda noticed the smell. Not ash. He'd grown noseblind to that. Something else. Death. Coming from inside the cave. How many had already died in there? How many more would? "Papa," his daughter tugged his arm. "Look." She pointed east, where the horizon should have been. But there was no horizon anymore. Just a wall of absolute darkness, advancing like a living thing. True night was coming, and with it, temperatures that would kill anyone caught in the open. Kuda had led his people for 15 summers, made countless life and death decisions, but never this. Fight for the cave and watch his family die in battle. Accept exile and watch them freeze in darkness. The wind howled, driving ash like frozen needles. Someone's baby wailed. He couldn't tell whose anymore. The darkness crept closer, eating the world inch by inch. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, Toba continued to vomit death into the sky, unaware and uncaring that below its ash cloud, humanity was learning the hardest lesson of all. When the world ends, it doesn't end all at once. It ends one impossible choice at a time. The mountain didn't care about species. When Toba split the earth open, it sent death equally to all humans who walked the planet. But those humans weren't all the same. 3 different kinds of human watched the sky darken that day, each bringing different tools, biological and technological, to the fight for survival. In the frozen forests of Europe, Grak of the Neanderthals felt the ground shudder. Built like a linebacker, with a barrel chest that could process thin air and muscles that made Homo sapiens look like children, he barely glanced up from butchering a reindeer. Earthquakes happened, the sky darkening. Winter came early sometimes. When you're built for ice ages, a little volcanic winter doesn't immediately register as apocalypse. His clan of 12, all family, all looking like variations of the same stocky template, had claimed this German valley for 3 generations. They knew every cave, every stream, every migration route. When ash began falling 2 days later, Grak's grandmother simply moved their activities deeper into the cave. "Strange snow," she grunted in their simple language, examining the grey flakes. "Tastes of fire." Neanderthals had survived 300,000 years of European weather that would kill a modern human in hours. Their bodies were furnaces, requiring 5,000 calories a day just to maintain baseline metabolism. When the volcanic winter dropped temperatures another 15 degrees, they simply ate more. When the reindeer grew scarce, they switched to rabbits, then birds, then things modern humans would consider inedible. We endure, Grak told his son, teaching him to nap flint in the dimness. Sky changes, land changes, we remain. 4,000 miles east, the Denisovans faced Toba with different gifts. Lynn, though she had no name for herself beyond the gesture that meant self, stood 7 feet tall on the Tibetan plateau. Her people were giants among humans, with lungs that could process air at altitudes that would leave others gasping. When Toba's ash began falling, they were already living in one of Earth's harshest environments. The Denisovan response was mobility. Within days of the eruption, Lynn's band had packed their few possessions and begun walking, not in panic, but with purpose. They'd survived by never staying still, by following resources across impossible landscapes. Volcanic winter was just another reason to move. The high paths remained clear, Lynn's mate observed, studying the ash patterns. Up here, winds scoured the peaks clean, even as valleys filled with grey death. We go above the ash. Her people had another advantage, genetic diversity that would make modern humans jealous. Where Homo sapiens were already bottlenecking toward genetic uniformity, Denisovans carried adaptations for everything: altitude, cold, disease. Some could digest plants that would poison others. Some had night vision that turned darkness into mere dimness. But it was in Africa where the species facing extinction brought intangible weapons to the fight. Kuda's Homo sapiens had neither Neanderthal strength nor Denisovan endurance. Standing outside the overcrowded cave, watching darkness swallow the world, they had bodies built for running, not fighting, lungs that needed clean air, metabolisms that demanded regular feeding. But they had something else. The river, his daughter whispered, the same one who'd almost made her first kill before the world ended. The ash is falling, but it's not sticking to the water. If we follow the river, it leads to the coast, Kuda finished. His mind raced, not just following water, but following it to where rivers met ocean, where shellfish clung to rocks, where seaweed grew, where ash couldn't contaminate everything. Inside the cave, the 3 bands were already beginning to fight over space, over water, over fear. But Kuda was thinking further ahead, not just tonight, not just tomorrow, but next season, next year. We need more than shelter, he told his band. We need a plan. That word, plan, didn't exist in Neanderthal vocabulary. Denisovans had no concept for it. But Homo sapiens had been planning since before they were fully human, planning hunts, planning seasons, and now planning for apocalypse. While Grak's Neanderthals hunkered down to outlast the winter through sheer biological stubbornness, and Lynn's Denisovans walked their traditional paths above the ashline, Kuda's sapiens began something revolutionary. They adapted their behavior faster than their bodies could evolve. We make masks, he decided, remembering how one mother had wrapped her baby's face. Everyone. Now, tear cloth. Use water to dampen it. The ash can't kill what it can't reach. We travel at night when the ash settles. Another added, rest during the day under shelter. We send scouts ahead to find clear water. We share knowledge with other bands. That last suggestion stopped everyone cold. Share with strangers, during catastrophe, when every resource might mean life or death. The mountain fights all humans, Kuda said slowly. Maybe all humans must fight together. It was a thought too radical for its time, but then so was survival. Across the dying world, 3 different humanities faced the same disaster with different strategies. Neanderthals would endure through biological toughness, surviving in their European strongholds for another 30,000 years before finally succumbing. Denisovans would disperse so thoroughly they'd become ghosts, leaving only genetic traces in modern populations. But Homo sapiens, they would do something unprecedented. They would change. Not their bodies, that took too long, but their minds, their tools, their social structures. They would transform disaster into opportunity. Standing in the ashfall, watching his daughter tear strips from her precious coming-of-age garment to make masks for the children, Kuda couldn't know he was witnessing evolution in real time. Not biological evolution, but something faster, more powerful, cultural evolution. The ability to solve new problems with new ideas, then spread those solutions faster than genes ever could. The mountain had attacked all humans equally, but only one species would turn catastrophe into catalyst, and that made all the difference. The ash was just the beginning. The real killer came wrapped in silence, invisible, patient. It slipped under furs, crept through cave walls, turned breath to fog and blood to slush. The volcanic winter had arrived. Mara found her son at dawn, or what passed for dawn, in the eternal grey, frozen, curled in the fetal position, his small body drawn tight against a cold that had stolen in while the exhausted adults slept. He'd been alive at middle night when she'd last checked. Sometime in those dark hours, the temperature had dropped below what a 6-year-old could survive. She didn't scream. Screaming wasted heat. 20 degrees colder than yesterday, Kuda muttered, reading the frost patterns on the cave walls. His band had found their own shelter, smaller than their traditional cave, but uncontested. 17 of them huddled in a space meant for 5. The closeness that had felt suffocating yesterday now meant survival. "The boy makes 3, someone whispered. 3 dead in 2 days, all children. The math was simple. Smaller bodies lost heat faster, less fat reserves, higher metabolism. The cold was culling the future first. Outside, the world had transformed into something from nightmares. The perpetual ash cloud trapped Earth's heat from escaping while blocking the sun's warmth from entering. Temperatures plummeted, then stabilized at levels that would have been considered severe winter before Toba. Now it was the new normal. "Look," Kuda's daughter pointed through the cave mouth. A family of baboons sat frozen in the trees, still gripping branches. Death had come so fast, they hadn't even fallen. Further out, a leopard lay stiff beside its half-eaten kill, predator and prey united in ice. The cold was democratic in its killing. But humans had something others didn't. Fire mastery. "We need more wood," Kuda announced. Simple words that meant probable death. Every expedition outside was a gamble. The cold killed in stages, first the fingers and toes, then confusion set in, then sleep that never ended. They'd lost a hunter yesterday who'd sat down to rest and never stood up. "I'll go," offered Taku, the strongest of their young men. "We all go," Kuda corrected. "Groups of 3. 1 watches for wood, 1 watches for danger, 1 watches the watcher." He'd learned this yesterday when they'd nearly lost someone to the creeping stupidity that came with cold. And everyone counts to 100. When you reach it, you turn back, no matter what. They wrapped themselves in everything they had. Furs layered over furs, ash-caked hides that stank but held heat, grass stuffed between layers for insulation, an innovation born from desperation when they'd noticed dead grass stayed warmer than bare skin. The world outside was alien. Ash had drifted like snow, creating a landscape of grey dunes. Familiar landmarks vanished under the monochrome blanket. Trees stood like skeletal hands, their leaves long dead, branches brittle with frost. The only sound was the crunch of ash underfoot and the wheeze of breath through makeshift masks. There, someone pointed, a fallen tree probably killed by ash weight. Wood meant warmth, meant life. But as they approached, shapes emerged from the grey. Another band, also desperate for fuel. 7 adults, all armed, all looking at the same life-saving wood. "We were here first," their leader stated. A woman, Kuda noted with surprise, strong-looking despite the circumstances. "Wood belongs to no one," Taku growled, raising his spear. "Stop," Kuda commanded, then louder to the other band. "There's enough. We take half. You take half." And if we want it all? The woman's eyes were hard. Behind her, Kuda could see children, shivering, dying. Then we fight. Some of us die, maybe all of us. And while we bleed in the ash, the cold kills our children. He lowered his spear. Or we share, and maybe some children see tomorrow. The moment stretched taut as frozen sinew. In the before times, territories were sacred, resources were defended, but the before times had burned with Toba. The woman lowered her weapon. Half. They worked together in silence, hacking at frozen wood with stone tools. No energy wasted on words. When they'd gathered what they could carry, the two bands parted without ceremony. But Kuda noticed something. The woman's band headed toward caves he knew. If they survived, they'd be neighbors. Back in their shelter, the new wood-fed fires that had burned continuously since the eruption. Fire was life now, more precious than food. You could survive weeks without eating. Hours without warmth meant death. "We need better insulation," Kuda's daughter observed. Always thinking, that one. She'd been experimenting, packing ash between two hides. The ash holds air. Air holds heat, like the fur of winter animals. It worked, not perfectly, but enough. They created ash-filled blankets, crude but functional. Another innovation born from necessity. How many more would they need? Night fell. True night, not the perpetual twilight of Ash Day. The temperature dropped further. They slept in piles, children in the center, adults forming living walls against the cold. Privacy was a luxury the dead could afford. Sometime in the darkness, Kuda woke to silence. The baby that had cried constantly since the eruption had stopped. He knew without checking. Another small body that would need to be moved outside come morning. Another mother who would keen silently, saving her energy for survival instead of grief. The killing cold was patient. It didn't chase like predators or strike like lightning. It simply waited, stealing heat 1 degree at a time, claiming those who made mistakes, who ran out of fuel, who gave up. By morning, that grey approximation of dawn, the frost inside their cave had grown thicker. Water froze in their gourds. Breath came in painful gasps that burned throats already raw from ash. "How long can this last?" someone asked. Kuda didn't answer, couldn't answer. The cold had killed more in 3 days than lions had in 3 years. And somewhere high above, beyond the ash cloud that had stolen their sky, Toba's violence was just beginning to circle the globe. The volcanic winter wasn't a season, it was a new age, and only those who could change faster than the temperature dropped would live to see its end, if it ended at all. The last green leaf in their territory fell on the 7th day. Kuda watched it spiral down, a brown, ash-covered thing that crumbled when it hit the ground. Around him, a forest that had fed his people for generations stood like a skeleton army, dead. All of it dead. "Papa, I'm hungry." His daughter's words cut deeper than any spear. They'd been rationing their dried meat for days, but 37 people, now 32, consumed food faster than hope. The usual fallback of roots, berries, and leaves was gone. The plant eaters had died first. Now, the meat-eaters would follow. "We still have the seeds," old Naya suggested, clutching the leather pouch that held their emergency food, seeds they'd normally plant come spring, if spring ever came again. Enough for maybe 3 days if we grind them. Seeds meant future. Eating them meant admitting there might not be one. But hungry children didn't care about philosophy. Kuda made the call. "We eat half, save half." A compromise with extinction. The ash hadn't just blocked the sun, it had poisoned the earth. Even plants that initially survived the darkness died when their roots absorbed water tainted with sulfur and fluoride. The lucky ones died quickly. Others lingered, their leaves spotted with chemical burns, stems softening with rot. "The trees bleed," Taku reported from a scouting expedition. He was right. Gashes in bark wept a black, tar-like substance. The forest was dying from the inside out. But humans adapt. Where plants died, opportunity grew. "Bark," Kuda's daughter announced, returning from her own exploration. "The inner bark. It's bitter, but..." She held out strips of pale material. "Not poisonous. I tested it yesterday." "You tested it?" Kuda's fear flared into anger without telling anyone. Someone had to. Her eyes held that dangerous mix of youth and wisdom that catastrophe breeds. Better me than a child. They learned to process bark, boiling it in precious water to leach out toxins, pounding it into a paste that could almost fool an empty stomach into thinking it was food. Pine needles, still clinging to dead branches, could be steeped into a tea that provided vitamin C. Lichen, that strange, not quite plant, survived where others died and could be scraped from rocks. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. "The other bands are moving," reported their scouts. Mass migrations had begun. Humans following rumors of valleys where plants might have survived, places where the ash fell thinner. Some headed for the coast, Kuda's original plan, though they'd been forced to shelter too soon. Others went underground, literally, searching for roots and tubers that might have escaped the poison. One morning, they woke to find another band had arrived in the night. 23 souls, looking like walking corpses. Their leader, the same woman Kuda had shared wood with, approached with something like shame in her eyes. "We have children," she said simply, "and you have fire." Kuda's band now numbered 32. Adding 23 more mouths seemed like suicide. But the woman held out a basket. Inside, mushrooms. Somehow, impossibly, mushrooms. "They grow in the dead trees," she explained. "The ash and death. It feeds them. Mushrooms, fungi, the decomposers that turn death into life. In the plant apocalypse, they thrived. It was salvation wrapped in irony, life sustained by feeding on death." The two bands merged out of necessity. 55 people crammed into spaces meant for 20. But more people meant more foragers, more innovations, more chances for someone to discover the next bitter root or poisonous-looking growth that turned out to be food. They developed a grim protocol. One person would try a new potential food, a tiny amount. Wait a day. If they lived, increase the dose. Wait again. Only after 3 days without illness would it be declared safe. They lost 2 adults this way, heroes whose names would be forgotten, but whose sacrifice meant survival. Children learned to eat things that would have made them retch in the before times. Grubs pulled from dead wood. Bone marrow sucked from skeletons they found. A paste made from ground acorns that required days of processing to remove tannins. Calories were calories. Disgust was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Look at this," one of the new band members, a young man named Pilar, showed Kuda. He'd been experimenting with the ash itself. Mix it with water and the bitter bark. It changes something, makes it easier to eat. Accidentally, he'd discovered that activated charcoal could neutralize some plant toxins. They didn't understand why it worked, only that it did. Another tool in their arsenal against starvation. But for every innovation, the world offered new cruelty. Animals that had survived the initial die-off now competed for the same scarce resources. A pack of starving hyenas attacked their foraging party, desperate enough to hunt humans in daylight. They lost an elder and barely drove off the rest. Even the hunters are becoming prey, Kuda observed. Worst were the other human bands. As food grew scarcer, territories that had been respected for generations became battlegrounds. They found evidence of violence, bodies bearing spear wounds rather than starvation's slower signatures. The math of survival was turning ugly. Fewer humans meant more food for those who remained. "We could take what others have gathered," Taku suggested one night. He'd lost weight like everyone, but his eyes had gained something harder. "We're stronger than some bands." "We are not animals," Kuda said firmly. "We're not plants either," Taku shot back. "And look how well staying rooted worked for them." The argument revealed a growing fracture. Some wanted to become raiders, taking from the weak. Others pushed for cooperation, sharing knowledge and resources. Both strategies had merit. Both had killed bands who'd chosen wrong. Kuda chose a middle path. They would defend what they had, but share knowledge freely. When they discovered a new food source, they told other bands. When others found something, they learned. It wasn't altruism, it was practicality. Dead neighbors couldn't discover new foods. By the 10th day, their original territory was bare. Every edible thing stripped, processed, consumed. Even the mushrooms grew scarce as more bands discovered them. The forest that had seemed infinite was revealed as heartbreakingly finite. "We move tomorrow," Kuda announced, coastward, following the original plan. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue for. The plants were dead, the animals were dying, and humans would follow unless they found new grounds to forage. As they prepared for the migration, Kuda's daughter brought him something, a small pouch. "Seeds," she said. "I've been saving one from everything edible we've found. Bark pine, ash mushroom, even the bitter root." He stared at her, this child forced to become a woman by catastrophe. She was thinking beyond survival. She was thinking about after, if there was an after. "For when the sky clears," she added. Kuda hugged his daughter, feeling her bones through too thin skin. She still believed the sky would clear, that plants would grow again, that seeds saved today might feed children not yet born. Hope. The most dangerous food of all, and the only one that might sustain them through the hungry darkness ahead. The child's cough started small, a tickle, an irritation. Within hours it became a wet, hacking thing that brought up grey-tinged phlegm. By nightfall, little Asha was drowning in air. "Hold her upright," the healer woman commanded. Though what healing could she offer against an enemy that came with every breath? The ash had found its way into everything. Lungs, throat, eyes. It was killing them from the inside out. Kuda watched helplessly as more of his merged band developed the ash cough. The elderly fell first, their already weakened lungs no match for the volcanic glass particles that sliced microscopic cuts with every breath. Then the children, then everyone. "We need..." Taku broke off, coughing so hard he doubled over. When he straightened, blood spotted his lips. They needed clean air, but where in this grey hell could they find it? "The water," Kuda's daughter croaked through her own raw throat. "When we put cloth in water and breathe through it." She demonstrated with a strip torn from her wrap, soaking it and holding it over her nose and mouth. "It catches more ash." Primitive, but it worked. Sort of. They tore every spare piece of hide, every scrap of fur, creating makeshift filters. Breathing became a conscious act. Inhale slowly through wet cloth. Try not to cough. Fail. Start again. But water was precious, and keeping cloth damp meant constant maintenance. They developed a rotation, 2 people whose job was simply to keep the masks wet while others slept. Life reduced to the basic equation of breath. "My eyes," one of the newer band members moaned. The volcanic ash wasn't just suffocating, it was blinding. Tiny glass shards scratched corneas, causing infections that turned eyes to weeping, pus-filled horrors. They learned to wash eyes with boiled water, to blink frequently, to resist the urge to rub that only ground the glass deeper. The ash attacked everything. Teeth wore down from grit in their food. Skin developed rashes that cracked and bled. But lungs were the battleground where most lost the war. 3 more died in 2 days. All from the suffocation that came not quick like drowning, but slow like being buried alive from the inside. They'd gasp like landed fish, chest heaving but no oxygen reaching blood. The healers tried everything, teas from boiled bark, steam from heated water, even cutting airways open in desperate attempts to bypass clogged passages. Nothing worked. The ash was patient, inevitable, inescapable. "We go deeper," Kuda decided, "further into the caves, where ash cannot follow." But deeper meant darker, meant bad air of a different kind, meant choosing between suffocation by ash or suffocation by stillness. They compromised, deep enough to escape the worst ashfall, shallow enough to breathe. The cave system they'd sheltered in turned out to be extensive. Passages led to chambers, led to more passages, and in the deepest parts they found something that made Kuda's skin crawl. Other humans. Lots of them. "No room," came voices from the darkness. "Find another cave." But there were no other caves. Everyone had the same idea. The underground had become humanity's last refuge, and it was filling fast. Negotiations were tense. Kuda's band now numbered 47 after the ash deaths. The deep cave dwellers had maybe 60. Add them together, and air itself became a resource to fight over. "Ah, we have children dying," Kuda tried. "So do we. Everyone does." In the end, territory was marked by invisible lines. This chamber for Kuda's people, that passage for the others, neutral ground for waste. Water sources shared with suspicious cooperation. The ash had driven humans underground like moles, and like moles, they were learning to live in darkness. But living underground brought new problems. Smoke from fires had nowhere to go. They learned to build small fires, positioned under natural chimneys in the rock. Even then, the smoke mixed with ash to create a toxic fog that burned eyes and throat. "Listen," the healer woman said one night. They did. The sound of dozens coughing echoed through the caves, a symphony of suffocation. "We all die if this continues." She was right. They needed solutions beyond wet cloth and deep caves. Kuda's daughter, ever the innovator, had been experimenting again. "Tree sap," she announced, holding up a glob of pine resin. "Melt it, mix with water, let it cool, breathe the vapor." It helped, somehow. The pine vapors opened airways, at least temporarily. They created primitive inhalers, heated stones dropped in water mixed with resin, heads covered with hides to trap the steam. For a few precious minutes, people could breathe almost normally. Word spread through the cave network. The other band wanted to trade for pine resin. Negotiations that would have been simple in the before times became complex. What was breathable air worth? Food? Tools? Territory? Information, Kuda decided. They show us other remedies. We share the resin. It began the first medical exchange. The deep dwellers had discovered that certain clay, when mixed with water and drunk, helped with the stomach cramps that came from eating ash-contaminated food. Another group had found that charcoal paste drew infection from ash cuts. Knowledge became currency in the underground economy. But no remedy could stop the dying. The ash cough claimed victims daily. Bodies had to be moved to the deepest, most isolated chambers. Burial outside was impossible, with ash still falling. The smell of death, mixed with smoke and unwashed humanity, created its own toxic atmosphere. Children adapted fastest, as children do. They developed a way of breathing, shallow, careful, always through cloth, that became second nature. Adults who couldn't adapt died. Natural selection in real time, measured in breaths. "We're becoming different," the healer woman observed one night. "Changed. The ash is making us into something else." She was right. Humans were evolving, not biologically, that took too long, but behaviorally. Every adaptation, from breathing techniques to underground navigation, was being carved into cultural memory. Those who couldn't change fast enough joined the corpse chambers. One morning, if morning had meaning in the eternal grey, they woke to find the ashfall had lessened, not stopped, but thinned. For the first time in weeks, visibility extended beyond arm's reach. "We could travel," someone suggested, "find better caves, maybe places where the ash hasn't reached." But travel meant exposure, meant leaving the devil they knew for ones they didn't. The debate raged for days, interrupted constantly by coughing fits that reminded everyone why they'd hidden underground in the first place. Finally, Kuda made the decision. "We send scouts, small groups. They search for cleaner air and report back." The first scouting party never returned. The second came back with tales of ash drifts 20 feet deep, of valleys filled with grey death, of no escape in any direction. The third brought news that changed everything. "The coast," the lead scout wheezed through his mask. 5 days' walk, maybe 6. The ash is thinner there, and the water cleans the air. Hope. Dangerous, painful hope. But what was the alternative? Dying underground, lungs filled with glass, children forgetting what sunlight looked like. "We prepare," Kuda announced. "Gather resin, make masks for everyone, plan the route. In 3 days, we go." The deep dwellers watched their preparations with something like envy. Some asked to join, others warned of dangers. Other bands turned feral, the ash storms that could bury travelers, the simple mathematics that said most who left the caves would die on the journey. All true, all irrelevant, because staying meant certain death, just slower. At least traveling meant dying with sky overhead, even if that sky was grey poison. On the last night, Kuda's daughter came to him with a bundle. "Masks," she said, "special ones, double-layered, charcoal paste between the layers, and these," she held up hollow reeds, "breathing tubes, in case we must hide from ash storms." 13 years old, and she was inventing respirators. Pride mixed with sorrow in Kuda's chest. What kind of childhood was this, where play meant designing better ways to breathe? "Will we make it, Papa?" she asked. For a moment, she was just a scared child again. "We'll make it," he lied. But maybe, with her innovations and their determination, it wouldn't be a lie. Maybe some would reach the coast. Maybe the ocean air would clean their lungs. Maybe. The Great Suffocation had taken almost half their number, but it had also taught them that humans could adapt to breathe anywhere, underground, through water, through cloth and charcoal, and hope. They'd learned to breathe poison and live. Now they'd see if they could breathe ocean and thrive. The stream that had sustained Kuda's people for generations looked normal, flowed normal, even sounded normal. But when young Pila knelt to drink, the water that touched his lips might as well have been liquid fire. He jerked back, spitting and gagging. "It burns." Kuda dipped his own fingers, touched them to his tongue. The familiar water now carried a sharp, metallic taste that made his mouth pucker. But worse was what he couldn't taste, the fluoride levels that would rot teeth, the sulfuric compounds that would eat stomach linings, the microscopic glass shards that would lacerate from the inside out. "No one drinks," he commanded, "not until we know." But they were already 3 days into their journey to the coast, and their water gourds were nearly empty. The math was simple. Humans could survive weeks without food, days without water. Hours in the ash-laden air were using up moisture faster than ever. The ash? The healer woman diagnosed, examining the stream. A grey film covered the surface, and the water itself had turned murky. Everything that fell from the sky is now in the water. They tried filtering through cloth, still burned. Tried letting it settle. The clear top layer burned worse than the muddy bottom. One desperate soul tried drinking it anyway. Within hours he was vomiting blood. "We dig," Kuda decided. "Maybe the groundwater." They dug with tools, with hands, with desperation. 3 feet down, water began seeping into their hole. Someone tasted it. Less burning, but still wrong. They dug deeper. At 6 feet, the water ran clearer, tasted almost normal. Almost. "It's the best we'll find," Kuda declared. They drank sparingly, knowing even this might be killing them slowly. But slow death beat fast death. That was the new mathematics of survival. The next stream they found was worse. Dead fish floated on the surface, their flesh already rotting. The smell alone warned them away. But dead fish meant something else. Somewhere upstream, the water was so poisoned that even creatures evolved to live in it couldn't survive. "We follow streams to their source," Kuda's daughter suggested. "Springs from deep underground, before the poison can enter." It meant going backwards, uphill, away from their coastal destination. But what choice did they have? They followed a dying creek upstream for a full day before finding its source, a spring bubbling from between rocks. The water here tasted not clean, but cleaner. They filled every container, even made crude new ones from animal bladders they'd saved. But 53 people drank water faster than one small spring could provide. They needed a system. Groups, Kuda organized. Some guard the spring, some scout for others, some continue preparing food, and some... He paused, hating what he had to say. Some test new water sources. Being a water tester was a death sentence with a timer. Sip from a poisoned source. Wait to see how sick you got. Survive. Try another. Don't survive. At least the others knew to avoid that stream. They lost 2 testers in 3 days. Heroes whose names would be forgotten, but whose sacrifice meant the group learned which water would kill quickly versus slowly. But even safe water wasn't truly safe. People developed stomach ailments, cramps, bloody flux, dehydration that killed as surely as the ash. Children were worst hit, their smaller bodies less able to filter toxins. "Boiling," the healer woman insisted. "All water must be boiled." But boiling meant fires. Fires meant smoke that mixed with ash to create toxic clouds. Fires meant using precious fuel they needed for warmth. Everything was a trade-off, and every trade cost lives. They developed a routine. Find water source. Test carefully. Dig if necessary. Boil if possible. Drink sparingly, move on before the source was exhausted or other bands found it, because water had become something worth killing for. They found evidence at the third spring, bodies of 2 bands who'd fought over access. The winners were gone, probably following rumors of cleaner water elsewhere. The losers lay where they'd fallen, already being covered by ash. Kuda's band drank quickly and moved on before they could become the next casualties in the water wars. The rain, someone suggested hopefully. When the rains come, they'll wash the ash away. But when the rains finally came, they were worse than drought. The water fell grey, loaded with ash from the atmosphere. Where it touched skin, it burned. Where it pooled, it created a caustic slurry that killed plants even faster than the ashfall had. They learned to hide from rain, to cover their water sources during storms, to never, ever drink rainwater no matter how thirsty they were. The sky itself had become their enemy. Animals knew before humans did. Kuda watched a herd of antelope, the few survivors, walk past a poisoned stream without drinking. They followed the animals to a spring the beasts had found, reasoning that evolution had given them senses humans lacked. It worked until the animals began dying too. Then they were following ghosts and rumors, chasing stories of mythical clean water over the next hill, in the next valley, always just out of reach. The children adapted fastest, as always. They learned to survive on less water than seemed possible, learned to gather moisture from morning dew on rocks, the only relatively clean water available, learned that certain plants still held moisture in their roots if you knew where to dig. "We're becoming desert people," Kuda observed, and it was true. Humans who'd lived beside rivers for countless generations were learning the water-hoarding tricks of desert dwellers. Except this desert was everywhere, and it was made of poison. One morning, they found a miracle, a deep pool protected by overhanging rocks that had somehow avoided the worst contamination. The water was stale but clean, tasting of minerals rather than death. "We camp here," someone suggested. "Stay until it runs out." "And then," Kuda challenged, "when 50 people have drained it dry, what then?" They took what they needed and moved on. But Kuda noticed some of his band had filled extra containers, hiding them. Trust was beginning to fracture. When water meant life, sharing became harder. The worst came when they found a band of the very young and very old, abandoned by their healthy adults who'd gone searching for water and never returned. The children were dying of thirst, too weak to travel. "We can't spare water," Taku said bluntly. "We barely have enough for our own children." "Then we become the monsters," Kuda replied. They shared what little they could, knowing it might doom them all. Half the abandoned children died anyway. The survivors were absorbed into Kuda's group, more mouths needing water they didn't have. By the 7th day of their coastal journey, they'd covered less than half the distance. Water detours, the need to stop and dig, the constant search for clean sources, all had slowed them to a crawl. "Listen," Kuda's daughter said one evening. They listened. Nothing. Then, was that waves, or wind, or desperate imagination? "The sea," she insisted. "I smell salt." Salt, the ocean, where rivers met sea and water was infinite even if undrinkable, where coastal springs ran cleaner, where maybe, possibly they could stop running from poison and start living again. 2 more days, Kuda promised his people, maybe 3, we'll reach the coast. He didn't mention that they had water for maybe 1 day, didn't mention that other bands were also heading coastward, that the beaches might be as crowded and desperate as everywhere else, didn't mention that he had no idea how to make salt water drinkable. But his daughter was already working on that problem, experimenting with evaporation, with filtering through sand and charcoal, always thinking, always adapting. "Papa," she asked quietly that night. The old stories say the world was born from water. Do you think it will die from poisoned water too? No, Kuda said firmly. It will die from poison. But we will make it clean again, drop by drop if we must. She nodded and went back to her experiments. Tomorrow they would either reach the coast or die trying, but tonight she was figuring out how to drink the ocean. Evolution in action. Adaptation in real time. Humans had learned to breathe poison air. Now they were learning to drink poison water. What else would this grey hell teach them before it was done? The smell hit them first. Salt. Rot. But underneath, something else. Life. After weeks of ash-deadened forests and poisoned streams, the ocean's stench was perfume. Kuda's band crested the final hill and saw their salvation, a coastline that looked like the gods had forgotten to kill it. Water everywhere, someone laughed, half mad with relief. Then reality. Water we can't drink. But Kuda's daughter was already running toward the tide pools, dropping to her knees beside one. Look! Shellfish, hundreds of them clinging to rocks like promises. Mussels, limpets, things with no names but plenty of meat. The ash that had poisoned the land had barely touched the ocean's edge. Here, life continued its ancient rhythms. Food! Taku breathed, already prying a mussel loose. He ate it raw, juice dripping down his chin. Real food! Within minutes, the entire band was scattered across the rocks, gathering everything that moved and most things that didn't. Seaweed that looked like leather but tasted like hope. Crabs hiding in crevices. Fish trapped in pools by the retreating tide. But Kuda noticed something else. They weren't alone. Further down the beach, smoke rose from fires. Another band. Then another. As his eyes adjusted to distances his ash-dulled vision had forgotten, he counted at least 6 groups stretched along the coastline, all refugees like them, all discovering the same salvation. We need to claim territory, Taku urged, before the best spots are taken. But Kuda was watching an old woman from a distant band teaching children which shellfish would poison them. Watching men from different groups wordlessly coordinate to haul in a fishing net. The ocean was teaching its own lesson. There was enough for everyone, if everyone was smart. We share the knowledge, he decided, all of it. What kills, what nourishes, where to find it. The coastal bands developed an unspoken truce. Mornings were for gathering, each group working their stretch of beach. Afternoons for processing, smoking fish, drying seaweed, extracting salt. Evenings for sharing, information, innovations, sometimes food itself. Kuda's daughter became obsessed with water. The ocean was infinite but undrinkable. Springs near the coast ran cleaner but were few. She experimented constantly, building contraptions from shells and hides. Evaporation, she announced after days of failure and small success. The sun pulls water up, leaves salt behind. If we can catch it. She created crude stills, black rocks heated by sun, covered with hides, drops of condensation collected in shells. It produced maybe a cup of clean water per day. Not enough to live on, but proof it could be done. Word spread. Other bands improved the design. Someone discovered that certain seaweeds, when burned, produced ash that actually purified water instead of poisoning it. Innovation bred innovation, shared freely because everyone benefited. The beach provided more than food. Caves in the cliff faces offered shelter from the still falling ash. Kelp could be woven into rope stronger than anything they'd made before. Shells became tools, containers, even jewelry, the first anyone had worn since Toba. Children, those who'd survived, began to thrive. The reliable food, the cleaner air, the simple absence of immediate death, all combined to let them actually be children again. They played in tide pools, built things from sand, learned to swim. Swimming itself became survival skill. The best shellfish grew in deeper water. Fishing improved dramatically when you could follow schools instead of waiting for them. Some children, born since the eruption, took to water like they'd never known land. "We're becoming sea people," the healer woman observed, and she was right. Feet were developing thick calluses from barnacle-covered rocks. Lungs were learning to hold breath for long dives. Eyes were adapting to pierce the glare of water. But the ocean gave dark gifts too. Tides that seemed friendly could turn vicious, sweeping away the unwary. Storms drove waves that destroyed a week's gathered food in minutes. And the things that lived in deeper water weren't all friendly. They lost a young man to something with tentacles, lost a child to an infected cut from coral, lost an elder to eating a fish that looked safe but carried poison in its flesh. The ocean was generous but demanded respect. Months passed. The ash still fell but thinner. The sky remained grey but lighter, and along the coast humans weren't just surviving, they were adapting, innovating, becoming something new. Kuda stood watching his daughter teach a mixed group of children how to read tides. His band had grown, absorbing survivors, merging with others. The rigid boundaries of the old world had dissolved like salt in water. "The forests will grow back," someone said beside him. Another band's leader, someone he might have fought in the before times. "The ash will stop. The world will green again." "Yes," Kuda agreed, "but we won't go back. Not completely." The coast had saved them, but it had also changed them. They'd learned the ocean's rhythms, its generosity and cruelty. When the world healed, some would return inland, but others would stay, their children's children becoming the first true maritime humans. "Papa!" His daughter ran up, excited. "We found something." She led him to a tidal cave where the receding water had revealed walls covered in handprints. Old prints from before Toba. Their ancestors had been here, had known this refuge. But underneath, fresh prints. Dozens of them, from all the bands now living here. "We should add ours," she said. They did. Kuda's large hand, his daughter's smaller one, pressed into ochre mixed with ash and placed on the wall. A record, a statement. We were here. We survived. We adapted. Around them 50 hands from different bands added their marks. No longer separate tribes, but something new. Coastal people, ocean-adapted survivors. The salvation wasn't just the food or the cleaner air. It was the forced cooperation, the shared innovation, the breaking down of old boundaries in the face of common need. The coast had saved their bodies. But it had also, perhaps, saved something more important. It had taught them that humans survive better together than apart, even if it took the end of the world to learn it. The scream echoed off limestone walls at midnight. Not pain, rage, pure animal rage that came from finding your family's shelter occupied by strangers who answered words with spears. Kuda woke to chaos. His coastal band had grown to nearly 70 souls, too many for the beach caves they'd claimed. Some families had moved inland, seeking shelter in the limestone caverns that honeyed the cliffs. Good shelter, dry, warm, already occupied. "They attacked us." Mira, one of his sub-leaders, stumbled into the main camp with blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. "We found an empty cave, started settling in. They came from deeper inside, no warning, just violence." Behind her, 3 families dragged wounded members. A child whimpered with a dislocated shoulder. An elder pressed leaves against a spear wound. The coastal peace was shattering against an older truth. When resources were scarce, humans became wolves. "How many?" Kuda asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't matter. 20, 30, they knew the cave, every passage. We were blind in their territory. Territory. The word tasted bitter. On the beach, they'd learned to share. But caves were different, finite, defensible, worth killing for. We go back, Taku growled. Take what we need. And become them, Kuda challenged. But he saw the looks in his people's eyes. Weeks of coastal plenty had made them forget the desperate mathematics of scarcity. Now, with more survivors arriving daily, even the generous ocean was straining to feed everyone. Papa? His daughter, now 15 and wiser than her years should allow, touched his arm. What if we trade instead of take? Trade, with people who'd just bloodied their families. But she continued, they have caves, dry shelter, we have coastal food, shellfish, techniques for clean water. What if? What if? The two most dangerous words in a world that punished optimism, but also the only words that led to tomorrow. Kuda took 20 of his strongest, not to fight, but to look like they could. They approached the contested caves at dawn, weapons visible, but lowered. The cave dwellers emerged like shadows, equally armed, equally ready. You attacked families, Kuda stated, not accusation, fact. You invaded our home, their leader replied. A woman, scarred and thin but with eyes that had seen too much to fear more. We've held these caves since the ash began, defended them, bled for them. And now you're starving in them. The truth hung between them. Kuda could see it in their hollow cheeks, the way they stood like wind might knock them over. They had shelter but were dying for food. The coast provides, Kuda continued, more than we can eat. But we need shelter. Real shelter. Share the caves. The woman laughed bitterly. You'll take them once you know the passages. Then you come to the coast, learn our ways, take knowledge back. Negotiations took days. Trust was currency nobody could afford but everyone needed. Finally, they agreed to an exchange. 5 coastal families could shelter in the outer caves. In return, 5 cave dwellers would learn coastal foraging, bringing knowledge and food back. It worked. Barely. Suspiciously. But it worked. Until other bands heard about it. The limestone cliffs held dozens of cave systems, most occupied by desperate groups who'd claimed them through blood or luck. As word spread of the Coastal Cave Alliance, pressure mounted. Why trade when you could take? Why share when keeping meant surviving? One morning, Kuda woke to find 3 bands had formed their own alliance. Not for trade, for war. They wanted the best caves, the richest tide pools, the clean water sources, and they had the numbers to take them. 100 fighters, his scouts reported, moving this way. Kuda's mixed coastal cave group had maybe 40 who could fight. The math was fatal, but his daughter, ever thinking, had been watching the tides. The king tide, she said, tomorrow. It will flood the lower caves the beach approaches. If we time it right, they prepared through the night. Not for traditional battle, but for something older. Terrain warfare, cave dwellers who knew every passage, coastal people who could read water like language, combined knowledge that the attackers lacked. The warband came at dawn, confident in numbers. They split, half attacking the caves, half moving along the beach. Exactly as Kuda had hoped. In the caves, defenders who knew the passages led attackers into dead ends, ambush points, chambers where sound distorted and torches died from bad air. Not killing, driving them back, making every foot cost fear. On the beach, the defenders retreated steadily, drawing the attackers onto sandbars and rocky outcrops. Just as the warband thought they were winning, the king, Tide, arrived. What had been solid ground became churning water in minutes. Attackers who couldn't swim, most of them, found themselves trapped on shrinking islands. "Surrender or drown," Kuda shouted across the waves. They surrendered, wet, humiliated, but alive. And in that moment, something shifted. The defeated band had expected slaughter. That's what they would have done. Instead, Kuda's people pulled them from the water, shared food, treated wounds. "Why?" their leader asked, suspicious of mercy. "Because the ash is enemy enough," Kuda replied. "We don't need to be." Word spread differently now. Not of weak coastal folk to be raided, but of strong people who chose not to kill. More bands came, but for alliance rather than war. The cave systems became connected communities, each contributing something: shelter, food, water purification, tools. They developed systems, cave assignments based on need. Families with children got the safest spaces, elderly got the warmest. Rotation schedules so everyone spent time learning coastal skills. Shared defense so no single group bore the burden. But it wasn't utopia. Fights erupted over resources, territories, old grudges. Two men killed each other over a particularly rich tide pool. A family was exiled for hoarding food while children starved. The council that formed to manage disputes made hard choices daily. Yet it held. The cave network became humanity's first city, not of buildings, but of connected shelters. Population grew to over 300. Knowledge flowed like water through limestone, each innovation spreading rapidly. Kuda, now grey-haired and tired, watched children play who knew no band boundaries. His daughter had married a cave dweller's son, their child belonging to both worlds. The wars that had threatened to destroy them had instead forced cooperation. "We needed the fights," his daughter observed one evening, "to learn the cost of not fighting." She was right. The cave wars had taught them that victory through violence was temporary. The winners still starved if they couldn't gather food, still died from exposure if they didn't know shelter. Only cooperation was sustainable. When the ash finally thinned enough to see actual sunlight, when plants began their tentative return, the Cave Coast network had become something unprecedented. Not a band, not a tribe, a civilization in embryo, built on the simple recognition that diverse knowledge shared was better than singular knowledge hoarded. They'd entered the caves as desperate families. They emerged as a people. The wars hadn't been about caves at all. They'd been about learning to be human on a scale beyond kinship. And in that learning, they'd planted the seeds of every city yet to come. The river was dying. What had once rushed toward the sea now crawled through a landscape of ash-clogged channels and stagnant pools. Kuda's son-in-law, Paku, stood knee-deep in the murky water, trying to spear fish that were no longer there. Another failed hunt. Another day his pregnant wife would go hungry. "Nothing," he reported to the gathered fishers. "The fish are gone, like everything else." But Kuda's daughter, now a woman with innovations that had saved dozens, was watching the water with different eyes. The river wasn't empty. It was transformed. Where flowing water once carried fish to the sea, isolated pools now trapped them, concentrated them. "Not gone," she said quietly. "Captured." She led them upstream, following the dying river's course. In a bend where ash had dammed the flow, a pool 20 feet across held water that churned with life. Fish, hundreds of them, circled in their liquid prison, too many for the oxygen. They were suffocating slowly, mouths gasping at the surface. "The mountain made a trap," she observed. "We just need to close it." They worked fast. Stones piled across the pool's outlet, woven grass barriers at the narrow inlet. Within hours they'd turned nature's accident into humanity's first fish trap. The harvest was obscene, more fish than the band could eat in days. Word traveled fast. Other bands arrived to see this miracle. Some tried to claim the pool, others wanted to learn the technique. Kuda, remembering the cave war lessons, chose teaching over hoarding. Find the pools. Block the exits. Take only what you need today. Leave breeding stock for tomorrow. Simple rules that would echo through millennia of fishing culture. But his daughter was already thinking beyond. If accident could trap fish, what could intention do? She began with tidal observations. Certain fish followed high tides into coastal streams, then retreated with the water. What if they couldn't retreat? She experimented with walls of stones that let water pass but not fish. Failed, adjusted, failed, better. The breakthrough came from combining coastal and river knowledge. V-shaped stone walls that funneled fish into woven baskets, gates that could close when schools entered, pools connected by channels that concentrated fish naturally. It's not hunting anymore, Paku marveled, watching a trap fill itself. It's farming, but with fish. The technology spread and evolved rapidly. Each band added innovations, double-walled traps that sorted fish by size, tidal gates that operated automatically, preservation pools where live fish could be kept fresh for days. But the real revolution was social. Fish traps required cooperation, building, maintaining, harvesting. Individual ownership made no sense when tides and fish ignored human boundaries. The trap builders formed the first occupational guild, sharing knowledge across band lines. The fish teach us, Kuda observed. They school together for protection. We must school together for survival. Children born since the eruption learned trap construction like their parents had learned hunting. But where hunting was chance, trapping was certainty. Reliable food meant reliable futures. Population grew. Health improved. Time once spent desperately seeking calories could be used for innovation. The trap technology evolved into engineering. Channels dug to connect pools. Sluice gates made from woven branches and sealed with ash clay. Some ambitious builders even created multi-level systems that sorted fish by species. But success brought new challenges. Who owned the fish in a trap? The builders? The territory holders? Everyone? Disputes erupted. Some were settled with words, others with blood. The coastal council that had emerged from the cave wars took on new importance. They developed rules. Builders got first harvest. Territory holders got a share. Surplus went to communal stores. Violations meant exclusion from all traps. A death sentence when traps fed everyone. We're becoming something new, the healer woman observed. Not hunters, not gatherers, managers. She was right. The fish trap discovery had changed more than diet. It introduced concepts that would define civilization: sustainable harvesting, resource management, technological inheritance, occupational specialization. When the first green shoots appeared on land, plants returning to the ash-enriched soil, some bands began drifting inland, but many stayed coastal. The ocean had saved them. The fish traps had sustained them. Why leave? Kuda, now old enough to be called an elder, watched his granddaughter improving trap designs he couldn't fully understand. She worked with children from dozens of original bands, their shared technical language transcending old tribal boundaries. Your mother saved us with innovation, he told her. You're saving us with institution. She smiled, not fully understanding, but she would. The fish traps weren't just catching food, they were catching the future, channeling human cooperation into forms that would outlast their builders. From the dying rivers of the Toba Winter came the first aquaculture. From desperate survival came sustainable system. From isolated bands came interconnected communities. All because a woman looked at trapped fish and saw not just food, but possibility. The mountain had tried to kill them with ash and poison. They'd responded by inventing civilization, one fish trap at a time. The old firekeeper was dying. After 40 days of ash darkness, his lungs finally surrendered to the toxic air. But even as death rattled in his chest, his eyes never left the flames. His apprentice, a boy of barely 12 summers, held the old man's hand and tried not to panic. "Never let it die," the keeper wheezed. "Fire is everything now." The boy nodded, understanding the weight settling on his thin shoulders. In the before times, fire was comfort. Now it was the difference between human and corpse. Without fire, they couldn't boil poison from water, couldn't cook the questionable food that would kill them raw, couldn't see in the eternal twilight, couldn't keep the cold from claiming them one by one. But maintaining fire in the Toba winter was like keeping ice frozen in summer. Everything was damp with ash. Wood was scarce. The constant need to move meant carrying embers like precious cargo. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and darkness would swallow them forever. "Show me again," the boy begged, "the storm technique." With trembling hands, the old keeper demonstrated how to bank coals in sand to preserve them for hours, how to wrap embers in damp moss that would smolder, not burn, how to read smoke patterns that warned when fire was dying. Lessons learned from his keeper who learned from his keeper, stretching back to the first human who decided wilderness could be tamed. By nightfall, the old man was gone. The boy sat alone with humanity's most crucial responsibility. Around him, over 100 souls depended on the flames he tended. No pressure for a 12-year-old who'd lost his parents to the ash cough. "I'll help," a voice said. Kuda's granddaughter, the trap builder, sat beside him. 2 keepers are better than 1. Together, they developed new protocols. Fire watchers working in shifts. Multiple fire sources maintained so losing one didn't mean losing all. Emergency ember bundles carried by runners. The knowledge that killed the old keeper when hoarded would survive by being shared. But wood was becoming critical. The coastal areas had driftwood, salt-soaked but burnable. Inland meant dead forests, but also meant leaving the relative safety of the shore. Every expedition for fuel was a calculated risk. "Bones," suggested an elder who'd been quiet for days. "In the before times, we burned bones when wood was scarce. Marrow fat burns long and hot." They tried it, collected skeletons of the creatures that hadn't survived, cracked them for marrow, stacked them like cordwood. The smell was horrendous, burning bone mixed with rancid fat. But it worked. A single mammoth femur could burn for hours. Fire became currency. Bands with good sources traded embers for food. Those who lost their fires paid any price to rekindle. The boy keeper found himself a banker of flames, deciding who received the gift of light and warmth. One night, exhaustion overtook him. He dozed, woke to find one of the main fires reduced to cold ash. The backup fire still burned, but the failure ate at him. Lives depended on his vigilance, and he'd failed. "Everyone fails," Kuda told him. "That's why we have systems, multiple fires, multiple keepers. We plan for failure because we're human." But the pressure was aging the boy rapidly. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His hands, constantly tending fires, were masses of burn scars. He'd developed a cough from smoke inhalation that sounded too much like the old keeper's death rattle. Then came the innovation that changed everything. A coastal band arrived with strange rocks, black stones that seemed unremarkable until one was accidentally dropped in a fire. Instead of cracking like normal stones, it caught fire itself, burned steady and hot with little smoke. Coal, they called it, though the name meant nothing. They'd found a seam exposed by a landslide, black rock that burned better than wood. Suddenly, fire maintenance became manageable. A handful of black stones could burn all night. No more desperate wood gathering, no more bone stink. But coal created new problems. Who controlled the deposits? How much could be taken without depleting the source? The Coastal Council faced its first resource management crisis. Ration it, Kuda's daughter suggested. Each band gets an allocation based on size. Extra for families with babies or elderly. Emergency reserves for when other fuel fails. It worked mostly. Some hoarded. Some traded their allocation for food. But overall, the black burning stones meant survival became less desperate. The boy keeper could actually sleep full nights, knowing the coal-fed fires would survive his rest. Fire technology advanced rapidly. Wind screens built from stones and mud, chimney holes that drew smoke away from living spaces, reflector walls that directed heat where needed. Each innovation shared, improved, spread throughout the network. But fire revealed a darker truth. As bands grew larger, gathering around shared flames, disease spread faster. The coughing sickness jumped from person to person in the close quarters. Children who survived ash and cold died from proximity to other humans. "We need separation," the healer woman declared. "Family fires, distance between groups." It went against every instinct. In the cold darkness, humans naturally clustered, but the healer was right. Bands that maintained distance had fewer deaths. The irony cut deep. Fire brought them together, disease forced them apart. The boy keeper, now recognized as a master despite his age, traveled between groups teaching fire management. He showed them how to create fire beds, sand pits that held heat for hours, how to dry wood in smoke to make it burn better, how to read the colors in coal that predicted how long it would burn. One evening, sitting with Kuda's granddaughter, he made an observation that would haunt him. "We're not keeping fires anymore, we're keeping civilization." She nodded. "Without fire, we go back to being animals. Cold, sick, eating raw meat in darkness." "No," he corrected. "Animals never had fire to lose. We'd be less than animals. We'd be humans who forgot how to be human." The thought terrified them both. Somewhere in the genes of every person huddled around their fires was the memory of the first flame. To lose it now, after so long, would be failing every ancestor who'd kept the light alive. So they tended their fires with religious devotion, fed them coal and bone and precious wood, protected them from rain and wind and human stupidity, passed the knowledge to children who would pass it to their children. Because in the Toba Winter, fire wasn't just warmth and light. It was the thread connecting them to the humans they'd been before the mountain exploded, the promise that they'd be human still when the ash finally stopped falling. The boy keeper grew old tending flames, trained 100 others, saw fire technology advance from desperate ember hoarding to sophisticated heat management. But he never forgot that night when he dozed and almost lost everything. Fire was life. Fire was hope. Fire was the only light in a darkness that wanted to swallow human ambition. And as long as one ember glowed, humanity endured. The spear hit the tree 20 feet away with a dull thud. Too low, too weak. Lukey pulled it from the bark and walked back to his throwing position, his stomach cramped from hunger. 3 days since their last real meal. The rabbits were too fast, the remaining deer too wary, and throwing spears at small game was like trying to kill flies with clubs. "It's useless," he told his hunting partner Tam. "By the time we're close enough to throw, they're already running." Tam, younger but cleverer, was examining a dead branch. It bent without breaking, springy and alive despite the ash that had killed its tree. "What if," he said slowly, we could throw without throwing. Lukey thought the hunger had driven his friend mad, but Tam was already working, using a flint blade to shape the branch. He'd been watching the coastal trappers, how they use bent saplings to snap closed on fish. Same principle, maybe? For days, Tam experimented while others hunted traditionally and mostly failed. He tried different woods, different shapes, made strings from sinew, from plant fibers, from hair. Failed, failed, failed again. Waste of time, the hunt leader growled. Learn to throw properly instead of playing with sticks. But Kuda's daughter, now a grandmother herself, still innovating, saw something others missed. She watched Tam work, then quietly began her own experiments. Together, they discovered what would change humanity forever. The breakthrough came from combining ideas. Tam's bent wood, her string-making expertise from fish traps, a straight stick, light and thin, feathers from a dead bird split and bound to the stick's end. It looked like a child's toy. "Watch," Tam said, drawing the string back. The bent wood fought him, storing energy like a coiled snake. He aimed at a target 30 feet away, impossible range for a thrown spear. Released. The arrow flew too fast to follow. One moment in his hand, the next buried deep in the target. The gathered crowd went silent. "Again," someone whispered. He did. Same result. The hunt leader picked up the bow, tried to understand it. Drew. Released. The arrow flew wild, but it flew. Farther than any spear, faster than thought. How? Was all he could manage. Within days, everyone was making bows. Most failed. Wrong wood, wrong curve, wrong string tension. But enough succeeded. The Coastal Innovation Network kicked in. Someone discovered that heating the wood over fire before bending made it stronger. Another found that different arrows flew differently, heavy for big game, light for birds. The revolution was immediate. Hunters who'd been limited to 30-foot throws could now kill at 100 feet. Small game that had been impossible to hit became regular meals. Birds could be brought down in flight. But more important was the psychological shift. For the first time since Toba, humans weren't just surviving, they were advancing, creating something new instead of just maintaining old ways. "My daughter can hunt now," a mother observed, watching her 10-year-old practice. Too small to throw spears, but strong enough to draw a child's bow. The social implications rippled outward. Hunting had always been for the strongest. Now the clever, the patient, the accurate could contribute. Age mattered less. Gender mattered less. Skill mattered everything. An old hunter, joints too stiff for spear throwing, found new life with the bow. "I can't run," he said, sinking an arrow into a target, "but I can still feed my grandchildren." Arrow design became an art. Different heads for different prey. Blunt for birds to preserve meat. Barbed for fish. Sharp broadheads for deer. Each design tested, refined, shared. The boy firekeeper, now a young man, discovered that fire-hardened arrow tips flew truer and penetrated deeper. But success bred new challenges. More efficient hunting meant prey populations crashed faster. The council had to establish hunting territories, quotas, seasons. Conservation emerged from necessity. Kill everything now, starve later. "We're too good at killing," Kuda observed. "The bow makes us gods of death. We need to learn to be gods of restraint too." They developed rituals around bow construction, ceremonies for first kills, rules about what could be hunted when. The weapon was too powerful for uncontrolled use. Like fire, it needed cultural constraints to prevent it from consuming everything. Trade in bow materials began. Certain woods worked better. Yew, osage, bamboo where it grew. Regions with good bowwood traded with areas rich in sinew or proper arrowstone. The bow didn't just change hunting, it created economy. Combat too was transformed. The first time two bands faced each other with bows, the standoff lasted hours. Neither wanted to test this new arithmetic of death. Thrown spears you could see coming dodge. Arrows arrived like angry wasps, too fast for reaction. Changes. Everything. The War Council agreed. Defense. Raid. Territory. Everything. Fortifications that had never been needed suddenly were. Simple shields of wood and hide. Watchtowers where archers could command approaches. The bow made violence easier and therefore made peace more precious. But it was hunting where the revolution showed most. Success rates quadrupled. A skilled archer could feed a family alone. Groups that had been struggling suddenly had surplus. Time once spent desperately seeking food could be used for crafts, for innovation, for art. The first cave paintings after Toba appeared. Simple things. Stick figures with bows, animals pierced by arrows. But art nonetheless. The bow hadn't just fed bodies, it had freed minds. Tam, the inventor, became a teacher, travelled between bands showing construction techniques. But he always emphasized something beyond technique. The bow is powerful, he'd say, but power without wisdom is destruction. My partner Luki died last winter, shot by another human in a dispute over territory. The weapon I created to save us can also damn us. It was a lesson each generation would have to relearn, but for now, in the grey twilight of the Toba Winter, the bow was hope. It was innovation, proving that humans weren't just victims of catastrophe, but adapters who could create solutions as fast as the world created problems. Children born in the Ash World grew up thinking bows had always existed, but the elders remembered. Remembered when hitting prey meant getting close enough to smell its breath, when hunting meant accepting that the prey might kill you too. The bow ended that equality. For better and worse, it made humans the undisputed masters of killing at distance. And in a world where distance from danger meant life, it made them masters of survival itself. The spear had made humans hunters, the bow made them super predators. And the Toba Winter, which had seemed like extinction's victory, became instead evolution's classroom. The bodies were found at dawn, and what remained of them told a story no one wanted to hear. 3 adults, 2 children, not killed by ash or cold or disease. The marks on the bones were unmistakable. Stone tools had filleted flesh with the same practiced efficiency used on deer. "Don't look," Kuda told the gathering crowd, but it was too late. Everyone had seen, everyone understood. Somewhere in their network of cooperating bands, the unthinkable had become thinkable. Who was all Taku managed to say. The old warrior, who'd faced every danger the Toba Winter offered, looked shaken to his core. The tracker examined the area. Small band, maybe 8 people, desperate. She pointed to the children's bones. They ate the youngest first. Silence stretched like a held breath. They all knew hunger. The gnawing emptiness that made you chew leather, eat bark, consider things that shouldn't be considered. But this was the line that separated human from monster. "We find them," someone growled. "Kill them before they kill others." And become them. Kuda's daughter, now an elder herself, challenged. "Murder those driven mad by hunger. Where does it end?" The debate raged for hours. Some wanted vengeance. Others wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, but the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere out there, a band had chosen the darkest path, and if one group had fallen, others might follow. Double the watches, Kuda decided. Travel in larger groups. And He paused, hating what he had to say. Establish code words, so we know who we're dealing with. But the damage was deeper than security measures could fix. Trust, carefully built through seasons of cooperation, cracked like ice under spring sun. Bands that had shared freely now counted their members when strangers approached. Children were kept closer. The elderly worried they'd become emergency food. Then the second incident. A lone traveler arrived at a coastal camp, wild-eyed and rambling. He spoke of his band, trapped by ash slides in a box canyon, how they'd eaten everything, leather, bones, even tried boiling stones, how hunger had driven them to draw lots, how the losers had volunteered, sacrificing themselves so others might live. Volunteers, he kept repeating. They volunteered to save the children. The children. Different from murder, but was it? The line between sacrifice and slaughter blurred in the grey twilight of survival. The council faced questions that had no good answers. Was consensual cannibalism acceptable? What if it meant children lived? Where was the boundary between human necessity and human evil? We need rules, the healer woman said, clear ones, before hunger makes more choose. The rules they established were harsh, but clear. Any band that killed for food would be exiled, cut off from trade, from fire sharing, from the network that meant survival. But those who were dying could choose sacrifice, witnessed by others, with the understanding that it was gift, not theft. Most importantly, they established food reserves, common stores that no single band controlled. Emergency supplies for when hunting failed and gathering found nothing. It meant everyone ate a little less, so no one faced the ultimate choice. We're choosing civilization, Kuda explained to the assembled bands. Choosing to starve together rather than feast on each other. But not everyone agreed. Splinter groups formed, leaving the coastal network. They called the rules weak, the council soft. In the harsh mathematics of survival, they argued, only the strong should live. Why feed the elderly who couldn't hunt? Why save children who might not survive anyway? These wolf bands, as they became known, haunted the edges of inhabited territory, sometimes trading normally, sometimes vanishing with members they'd traded with. The uncertainty was worse than open hostility. One winter morning, a wolf band approached Kuda's settlement, 20 strong, well-fed despite the season. Their leader, a man with filed teeth who called himself Devour, made an offer. Join us, he said simply. We survive, always. No hunger, no watching children starve. Just practical choices. The silence stretched taut. Everyone knew what those practical choices were, but everyone also knew their own hunger, had seen their own children's ribs showing through skin. We have rules, Kuda said. Rules. Devour laughed. The mountain has no rules. The ash has no rules. Death has no rules. But you make rules that weaken you, that make you prey. No, Kuda's daughter stepped forward. Rules make us human. Without them, we're just clever animals. And clever animals with weapons are the worst kind of monster. The confrontation could have ended in blood. Both groups were armed, tense. But then something unexpected happened. One of Devour's band, a young woman, stepped away from her group. I'm tired, she said quietly. Tired of the taste. Tired of the hunting. Tired of becoming less human with each meal. Others followed, not many. 3, then 5. Choosing possible starvation over certain damnation. Devour snarled but didn't fight. Even wolf bands had some rules, it seemed. He left with those who remained, vanishing into the ash-grey distance. The defectors told horrible stories, of children raised to see humans as prey, of rituals that made murder sacred, of a spreading darkness that threatened to consume whatever humanity the Toba Winter hadn't killed. We stop them, Taku said, now, before they grow. This time, Kuda agreed. Not vengeance, but prevention. United bands tracked the wolf packs, fought them when necessary, offered redemption to those who would take it. It was ugly, brutal work that no one celebrated, but it was necessary. Slowly, the wolf bands died out or reformed. Some were killed in fights. Others starved when their practical choices left them with no one to trust. A few rejoined human society, carrying guilt that would never wash clean. The last known wolf band leader was captured trying to raid a children's shelter, devour, thinner now, his filed teeth broken. The council debated his fate for days, death, exile, forgiveness. In the end, they chose something else. He would live, but he would tell his story. Travel between bands warning what happened when humans chose the easy darkness over the hard light. A living reminder of choices that should never be made. I was hungry, he said at each telling, tears streaming down his face. We were all so hungry, but hunger passes. What we did, what I did, that stains forever. The cannibalism crisis passed, not because hunger ended, but because humans chose cooperation over consumption, chose to see each other as partners, not provisions. It was perhaps their greatest victory, not over nature but over the darkness in themselves. Years later, when children asked about the time of choosing, elders would grow quiet. Then they'd explain how humanity had stood at a crossroads, how the easy path led to full bellies and empty souls, how the hard path led to hunger but also to hope. We chose to stay human, they'd say, even when being human meant suffering, especially then. And the children, bellies full of fish and gathered greens, would nod without really understanding, which was, perhaps, the greatest victory of all. That they could grow without knowing how close their species had come to choosing otherwise. The bones of the eaten were buried with ceremony, victims not just of hunger, but of humanity's test. Monuments to the price of choosing civilization over survival at any cost. They were never forgotten, but more importantly, they were never repeated. Because in the end, cooperation filled more bellies than cannibalism ever could. Little Aya was 7 winters old when she solved the water problem. While adults dug deeper wells and traveled further for clean sources, she noticed something they'd missed. The morning dew on certain rocks tasted clean. No ash, no burn. Just water, pure as the before times. The rocks sweat clean, she announced to her exhausted parents. They ignored her at first. Children's observations ranked low when survival consumed every thought. But Aya persisted, leading them to her discovery. Smooth stones angled just right, collected dew that hadn't touched ash-contaminated surfaces. Each rock yielded only drops, but many rocks meant water without poison. Word spread. Adults marveled at what they'd missed. Soon every band had children assigned to dew collection. Their small fingers better suited to the delicate work. It wasn't much, but in a world where every drop counted, the children's discovery meant survival for the weakest. Infants, elderly, the sick who couldn't travel to distant springs. Kuda watched his great-granddaughter lead a dew-collecting expedition and saw the future reshaping itself. These weren't children as his generation understood them. These were survivors molded by catastrophe, aged by necessity, wise in ways that broke his heart. They don't play, he told his daughter. They practice survival. It was true. Where pre-Toba children had played hunt the deer and build the shelter, these children played find the clean water and treat the ash cough. Their games were survival drills. Their toys were miniature tools. Their lullabies were lessons. 9-year-old Tico invented the ash shoes. Watching adults struggle through deep drifts, He wove broad platforms from reeds that distributed weight like snowshoes. His child-sized versions worked so well that adults copied them. The boy who should have been learning to throw play spears was instead teaching experienced hunters how to walk. "We're stealing their childhood," the healer woman lamented. "No," replied a mother whose 3 children had all survived, a miracle in itself. "Childhood is learning to be adult. These children are just learning different lessons." The lessons were harsh. Children learned to read death signs before they could count properly. They knew which coughs meant ash lung, fatal, versus wet lung, treatable. They could identify edible insects by age 5, prepare pine needle tea by 6, maintain fire by 7. By 10, they were full contributors to band survival. But they also learned cooperation at levels previous generations never achieved. "Watch them work," Kuda observed. No squabbling over resources, no hoarding. They shared automatically, instinctively understanding that group survival meant individual survival. The harsh teacher of Catastrophe had created perhaps the most cooperative generation humanity had ever seen. The children also adapted physically. Those who survived infancy developed remarkable resistance to respiratory infections. Their eyes, constantly irritated by ash, grew less sensitive. Their digestive systems processed foods that would have poisoned pre-Toba humans. Evolution accelerating in real time, measured in years instead of millennia. "They're becoming different," a grandmother noted, watching her granddaughter eat ash-contaminated roots without illness. "Different from us." Education transformed too. No leisure for decorative arts or elaborate stories. Children learned through urgent necessity. Mathematics meant calculating food distribution to prevent starvation. Geography meant memorizing clean water sources across vast territories. History meant remembering which foods had killed, which had saved. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. These children had never known abundance, never experienced casual waste, never lived without the spectre of extinction hovering close. It made them serious, pragmatic, unsentimental about survival choices. When 12-year-old Mira had to decide whether to share their band's last food with arriving strangers or save it for her own hungry siblings, she chose sharing without hesitation. "More people find more food," she explained with logic cold as winterstone. "Strangers become family when they help us live." The children formed their own councils, mimicking adult organization but often surpassing it in efficiency. They assigned tasks based on ability, not age or tradition. A 7-year-old with steady hands might lead tool-making, while a 12-year-old with good eyes became lookout. Meritocracy born from necessity. They also developed their own innovations. Children discovered that certain grubs, while disgusting, provided more nutrition than larger prey. They learned to follow specific birds to fresh carcasses. They created silent communication systems for hunting, better than adult versions because designed by those who'd never known different. "We thought we were teaching them," Kuda admitted. "But they're teaching us how to be human in this new world." The generational divide became stark. Adults carried memories of the before times, mourning lost abundance. Children knew only the ash world, finding joy in small victories, a successful hunt, a clean water source, a day without deaths. Their baseline for happiness had shifted so far that adults sometimes couldn't understand their satisfaction with mere survival. But child mortality remained horrific. For every innovation, every adaptation, death claimed 2 of 3 before adulthood. The survivors were those who combined intelligence, physical resilience, and luck in measures that would have seemed impossible before Toba. One evening, Kuda found a group of children teaching each other in the firelight. No adults involved. They'd organized their own knowledge sharing, each child expert in something. This one knew mushrooms, that one understood currents, another could predict weather from wind patterns. "Why do you do this?" he asked. 8-year-old Simi looked at him with eyes too old for her face. "Because if one dies, the knowledge lives. We all carry pieces. Together, we carry everything." The practicality chilled him, but she was right. These children understood redundancy, backup systems, distributed knowledge in ways adults were only beginning to grasp. They were creating a new kind of human culture, one where information was as precious as food and shared just as readily. When the ash finally began to clear, when plants started their tentative return, it was the children who noticed first. Their sharp eyes caught green shoots adults walked past. Their constant foraging discovered which new plants were edible. Their adaptability let them pivot from Ash World survival to Recovery World exploitation faster than their elders. "They'll rebuild better than we would," Kuda told his daughter as they watched children planning where to attempt agriculture. "We'd try to recreate the before times. They'll create something new. Something that can't be destroyed by the next mountain's anger." The children who survived Toba weren't just small adults. They were a new form of human, cooperative by necessity, innovative by requirement, unsentimental by experience. They carried the trauma of near extinction in their cells, but also the knowledge of how to survive it. When they grew up and had children of their own, they passed on more than genes. They passed on a culture forged in catastrophe, refined by necessity and proven by survival. A culture that assumed disaster, planned for shortage, and found joy in the marginal space between death and tomorrow. They were the children of ash and hunger, but they were also the parents of every human who would follow. And in their small hands, scarred by survival and wise beyond years, they carried the seeds of civilization's second chance. The mountain had tried to kill humanity. Instead, it created children who could survive anything, even the next mountain. Grok felt the mountain scream through his feet, but he didn't stop skinning the reindeer. His massive hands, strong enough to snap a wolf's spine, continued their delicate work. Earthquakes happened. Mountains grumbled. The reindeer still needed processing before the meat spoiled. "Skyfire," his daughter grunted, pointing north where the horizon glowed unnatural orange. Grok glanced up, assessed, returned to work. His people had survived ice storms that froze mammoths standing, had endured winters where the sun vanished for moons, had faced cave bears, saber cats, and weather that killed Homo sapiens like flies. Whatever the mountain was doing, it couldn't be worse than what Europe had already thrown at them. He was wrong, but his confidence wasn't misplaced. It was earned through 300,000 years of Neanderthal survival in the harshest conditions Earth offered. When the ash began falling 2 days later, Grok's band of 18 simply moved deeper into their cave system. These weren't the shallow, coastal caves Homo sapiens desperately crowded into. These were limestone labyrinths mapped through generations, with chambers for different seasons, different needs. "Strange snow," his mother observed, tasting the ash. At 70 winters, ancient by any measure, she'd seen everything. "Tastes of stone and fire, but we've eaten worse." That pragmatism defined Neanderthal response to Toba, where Homo sapiens panicked, innovated frantically, developed new technologies from desperation. Neanderthals simply endured. Their bodies were built for exactly this kind of catastrophe. The cold that killed sapiens' children barely registered to Neanderthal physiology. Barrel chests housing massive lungs processed thin air efficiently. Compact limbs conserved heat. Metabolisms that burned 5,000 calories daily were furnaces that laughed at dropping temperatures. When volcanic winter plunged temperatures another 15 degrees, Neanderthals simply ate more. Same as always, Grok told his son, teaching him to maintain stone tools in the dim light. World changes. We remain. But remaining required adaptations even Neanderthals hadn't faced. The ash-poisoned water sources they'd used for generations. Grok's band learned to melt snow from protected areas, to dig through ash layers to reach cleaner ice beneath. They didn't develop elaborate filtration systems like sapiens. They simply found cleaner sources and claimed them with a ferocity that made other humans flee. Food became the greater challenge. The reindeer herds, already stressed by regular climate swings, died in droves. But Neanderthals had always been opportunistic. They switched to smaller prey, rabbits, birds, anything that moved. Their powerful jaws crushed bones sapiens couldn't crack, extracting marrow that meant survival. All food is good food, Grok taught, demonstrating how to process a frozen bird carcass most would consider inedible. Crack the skull for brains. Splinter bones for marrow. Boil the rest into soup that could sustain a family for days. Nothing wasted. Nothing rejected. The social structure that seemed primitive to sapiens observers proved remarkably resilient. Neanderthal bands were extended families, often 3 generations of direct relatives. No complex alliances to maintain. No trade networks to collapse. Just family. Defending and providing for family as they'd done for millennia. When Grok's nephew broke his leg fleeing a cave-in, the band's response was automatic. They set the bone with expertise born from dealing with hunting injuries. They carried him when movement was necessary. They fed him from their own portions without discussion. This wasn't sapien-style calculated cooperation. This was instinct deeper than thought. But Neanderthals weren't unthinking brutes. In the depths of their cave, Grok's daughter created something remarkable. Using ochre and ash, she painted on the smooth wall. Not the elaborate scenes sapiens would later create, but something simpler, more profound. Handprints, dozens of them. The band pressing palms against stone, marking presence, saying simply, "We are here." The isolation that would have destroyed sapiens bands suited Neanderthals perfectly. They'd never relied on wide networks, on innovation spreading between groups. Each band was self-contained, carrying all the knowledge needed for survival in their genes and memories. When the ash made travel impossible, they simply stayed put. "Why would we leave?" Grok asked when a desperate sapiens band arrived seeking shelter. "Cave is good, has water, has warmth. Outside is death." The sapiens pleaded, offered to share coastal innovations, promised cooperation. Grok considered. His band was strong but smaller than before. Some genetic mixing might be wise. He allowed 3 sapiens to stay, 2 women and a man. The cultural clash was immediate. Sapiens wanted to modify everything, create better tools, improve hunting methods, build elaborate shelters within the cave. Neanderthals watched with amusement and occasional interest, but rarely adopted the changes. Their ways had worked for 300,000 years. Why change for a temporary catastrophe? But some innovations proved useful. A sapiens woman showed them how pine resin could seal wounds and prevent infection. Grok's mother, despite her age, learned the technique immediately. Practical knowledge was always welcome. Elaborate plans for future improvements were not. The hybrid children born from these unions embodied both strengths: Neanderthal physiology with sapiens adaptability. They survived better than either parent species, though they often seemed caught between worlds. Too innovative for pure Neanderthal bands, too robust for pure sapiens groups. As the volcanic winter deepened, even Neanderthal endurance was tested. game became so scarce that their massive caloric needs couldn't be met. Some bands began the long walk south, seeking warmer refuges. Others dug in deeper, literally, following cave systems to geothermal warmth. Grok's band found a chamber where warm springs bubbled from deep earth. The water tasted of minerals but was clean, untouched by ash. The warmth allowed them to reduce calories needed for heat. Small prey gathered near the warmth. It wasn't paradise, but it was enough. See, Grok told the Sapiens refugees, Earth provides. Just need to look in right places. But looking required knowledge accumulated over millennia. Which caves connected to deep systems? Which minerals in spring water were safe versus toxic? Which sounds in the darkness meant unstable rocks versus approaching predators? Knowledge that couldn't be innovated, only inherited. That was Neanderthal's strength and weakness combined. They survived through deep, inherited wisdom that made them perfectly adapted to their environment. But when environments changed faster than inheritance could follow, they struggled to innovate solutions. When a sapien suggested they could increase the spring's flow by digging new channels, Grok refused. The spring was good as it was. Changing it might ruin it. Better to endure with what worked than risk everything on what might work. This conservatism served them well through Toba. While Sapiens bands collapsed from failed experiments, Neanderthals plodded on with proven methods. Their survival rate was actually higher than their more innovative cousins. But it came at a cost measured in generations rather than seasons. Young Neanderthals, especially those with Sapiens ancestry, grew restless. They saw opportunities their elders ignored. Why not try the new hunting methods? Why not expand the cave network? Why not trade with distant bands for resources? The generational conflict that barely existed in pure Neanderthal culture emerged with hybrid vigor. Grok's own daughter, influenced by Sapiens thinking, suggested they could preserve meat by smoking it in special chambers. Traditional Neanderthal preservation involved freezing or immediate consumption. This new method could extend food supplies dramatically. Try, Grok finally agreed, worn down by persistence. It worked. The smoked meat lasted longer, traveled better. Other Neanderthal bands, seeing the success, slowly adopted the technique. Innovation by proven example rather than theoretical possibility. When the ash finally began to thin, when temperatures slowly climbed from catastrophic to merely harsh, Neanderthals emerged from their refuges largely intact. They hadn't thrived like some coastal sapiens groups, hadn't innovated dramatic new technologies, hadn't restructured their entire societies. They had simply endured, like they always had, like they always would, until they wouldn't. Because the world emerging from Toba's shadow was changing faster than Neanderthal conservatism could match. The sapien survivors weren't the scattered, desperate bands that had begged for shelter. They were connected, innovative, aggressive in their expansion. They'd learned to survive catastrophe through rapid change. Neanderthals had survived through stability, and in a stabilizing world, that would eventually prove their downfall. But that was future's problem. In the grey twilight of Toba's winter, Grok's band remained, solid, enduring, and unchanging as stone. They'd faced the worst Earth could offer and survived through sheer, stubborn refusal to be anything other than what they were. Neanderthal endurance had carried them through catastrophe. Whether it could carry them through recovery was a question their conservatism wouldn't let them ask. Lin stood on the Tibetan plateau at 14,000 feet, where the air was so thin that Homo sapiens would gasp like landed fish. But her lungs, larger than any human species before or since, processed the meager oxygen with ease. When the ash cloud from Toba crept across the horizon like a grey death shroud, she didn't panic. Her people had survived worse. "Moving weather," her mate grunted, using their simple language that was more gesture than word. He pointed at the approaching wall of ash. "We go higher, higher." Where sapiens would suffocate and Neanderthals would struggle, Denisovans thrived. Their bodies were laboratories of adaptation, genes for altitude, cold, disease resistance, dietary flexibility. They were evolution's wildcards, scattered across Asia like seeds waiting for the right catastrophe to bloom. But Denisovans left almost no fossils, a finger bone here, a tooth there, like ghosts that walked through prehistory, leaving only genetic shadows in modern humans. What we know comes from reading DNA like ancient scrolls, each gene telling stories of survival against impossible odds. When Toba's ash began falling, Lynn's band of 20 didn't hunker down like Neanderthals or frantically innovate like sapiens. They simply walked, always walking, never settling. Movement was survival, and Denisovans had perfected movement into an art form. "The high paths remain clear," Lynn observed, studying how ash accumulated in valleys but was scoured from peaks by wind. While other humans fought over contaminated water sources below, Denisovans drank from glacial streams above the ash line. While others starved as plants died, Denisovans followed yak herds that knew every patch of wind-swept grass. Their advantage was diversity, not cultural, but genetic. Where sapiens populations were already bottlenecking toward uniformity, Denisovans carried wild variations. Some could digest plants that would poison others. Some had night vision that turned darkness to dimness. Some produced heat like furnaces. Others needed barely any food. Every individual was an experiment in survival. Lynn herself carried genes that wouldn't be understood for 70,000 years, the EPAS1 variant that let her process oxygen so efficiently, the immune variants that made her resistant to diseases that hadn't evolved yet, the metabolism mutations that let her extract nutrients from foods others couldn't digest. She was a Swiss Army knife of human adaptation, and she didn't even know it. When her band encountered other Denisovans near a mountain pass, the meeting was cautious but practical. No elaborate greetings or negotiations, just an exchange of information through their gesture-heavy language. This path blocked by ash, that valley still had game. Water clean here, poison there. Information traded like currency, then both groups moved on. But sometimes they traded more than information. Lynn mated with a male from the other band, their coupling as practical as everything else. Genetic diversity through opportunity. No romance, no long-term bonding, just biology recognizing that mixing genes improved survival odds. The child she carried would have immunity to diseases from 2 regions, adaptations for challenges neither parent had faced. That casualness about interbreeding extended beyond their own species. When Lynn's band encountered a desperate group of sapiens trying to climb into the mountains, the meeting wasn't hostile. The sapiens were dying, altitude sickness dropping them like stones. But 3 of their women seemed less affected. Denisovan males mated with them without ceremony. The resulting children, if they survived, would carry high-altitude genes into sapiens populations. "They smell wrong, but breed right," was how Lynn's mother summarized it. Practical to the bone. Denisovans didn't build elaborate shelters, didn't create art, didn't develop complex tools. They survived through biological solutions to environmental problems. When the cold deepened, they didn't make better clothes. They metabolized more efficiently. When food grew scarce, they didn't innovate hunting. They digested foods others couldn't process. This biological approach extended to their tools. Where sapiens created specialized implements for every task, Denisovans used simple, multi-purpose tools that worked adequately for everything. A stone that could crack nuts, butcher meat, and defend against predators. Nothing fancy. Nothing that required teaching complex techniques to the next generation. Just functional simplicity that any Denisovan could recreate from available materials. Lin's band weathered the worst of Toba by following ancient patterns. Summer in the high meadows where grass still grew. Winter in protected valleys where geothermal heat created pockets of life. Spring following newborn yak calves. Autumn harvesting pine nuts from trees that grew above the ash line. The same cycle their ancestors had followed, just adjusted for new obstacles. But they weren't unthinking. When Lin discovered a hot spring that created a warm microclimate in a mountain valley, she remembered, when they passed that way again, she led the band there. Not innovation exactly, but memory applied to new circumstances. Denisovans didn't solve problems, they remembered solutions. The genetic evidence suggests Denisovan populations actually grew during Toba. While sapiens bottlenecked and Neanderthals endured in place, Denisovans dispersed and diversified. Different populations developed different solutions. Mountain Denisovans became even better at altitude. Island Denisovans developed seafaring skills. Forest Denisovans learned to process toxic plants. But this dispersion came at a cost. Denisovan populations were never dense. Bands might go years without encountering others of their kind. Languages, already simple, diverged into mutual incomprehension. Cultural innovations, rare to begin with, couldn't spread. Each band became an island of adaptation, perfect for its niche but unable to share that perfection. Lin lived to see her children grown, her grandchildren born. She watched the ash slowly stop falling, the skies gradually clear. She saw sapiens populations explode outward from their refuges, spreading across territories Denisovans had walked for millennia. She observed their complex tools, their elaborate clothes, their constant chatter and planning. Busy insects, she commented to her daughter, watching a sapiens hunting party spend days planning what Denisovans would simply do. Much motion, same result. But the insects were spreading. Denisovan strengths, biological adaptation, genetic diversity, environmental specialization, were slow strengths. They took generations to develop, populations to spread. Sapiens' cultural adaptations spread at the speed of teaching. What took Denisovans millennia to evolve, sapiens could learn in seasons. Still, Denisovans persisted. When sapiens reached new territories, they often found Denisovans already there, perfectly adapted to local conditions. The interbreeding continued, not through conquest or absorption, but through practical recognition that Denisovan genes solved problems sapiens' culture couldn't. Modern humans climbing Everest breathe through Denisovan lungs. Swimming in tropical waters resist diseases with Denisovan immunity. Surviving in Arctic winters burn calories with Denisovan efficiency. Lin's legacy lives in 1 billion people who never knew her name, never knew her people existed. The Denisovan Mystery isn't why they disappeared. They didn't, really. They dissolved into us, their genes becoming humanity's adaptation toolkit. The mystery is how a species that left almost no physical trace managed to leave such an indelible mark on human survival. Perhaps that was their greatest adaptation, the ability to become essential by becoming invisible. While sapiens built monuments to their presence, and Neanderthals left caves full of tools, Denisovans left only themselves, written in the DNA of their hybrid descendants. When Lin died, her band didn't bury her with ceremony. They left her body where it fell, already moving on to the next valley, the next season, the next survival challenge. She became part of the mountain, her bones scattered by weather and scavengers, leaving no trace for future archaeologists. But her genes marched on, carried in her children and their children, spreading across Asia and beyond. Every time someone thrived where others struggled, adapted where others failed, survived where others perished, Lynn's ghost smiled. Denisovans conquered through disappearance, survived through dissolution, won by refusing to play the game of species competition, instead becoming part of every player. The mountain had tried to kill all humans. Denisovans responded by becoming genetically immortal, one practical mating at a time. Not bad for ghosts. The red cliffs of Yemen trapped the sunset like blood in stone. Below, in caves that would shelter humans for the next 30,000 years, Asher's band prepared for another night of survival in their prison. Not a prison of walls they could leave any time. A prison of death that surrounded them on every side. To the north, the ash-choked wastelands of Asia. To the south, the Red Sea, narrower than today but still deadly to cross. To the east and west, deserts made more hostile by Toba's climate chaos. They were stuck in a pocket of survivable land, like insects in amber, waiting for the world to become livable again. "Tell us about the before walking," a child asked Osher, who at 40 winters was the oldest in their group. The only one who remembered when their grandparents had lived in Africa, before the Great Crossing, before the mountain's anger trapped them here. "We were many," she began, the ritual words worn smooth by repetition. "We walked where sun touched ground, then the sky burned and we became few. Now we wait for the walking time to come again." Waiting. That's what the Arabian refuge meant. Not the desperate scramble for survival happening elsewhere, but patient, grinding endurance. The climate here was harsh, but stable. The resources limited, but renewable. A place where humanity could persist without thriving, survive without expanding. The genetic evidence would later reveal the staggering truth. All non-African humans descended from maybe 1,000 individuals who weathered Toba in this Arabian refuge. For 30,000 years, they bred, lived, and died in an area smaller than Texas. Evolution in a bottle, pressed by isolation into new shapes. Asher's band numbered 60 souls, one of perhaps 20 groups scattered across the refuge. They knew every other band, had mapped every water source, had walked every path. There was nowhere new to go, no frontiers to explore. Just the same territories, the same faces, the same crushing sameness year after year. But in that sameness, something unique developed. With nowhere to expand, they expanded inward. Language grew complex because there was time for storytelling. Art flourished because materials were limited, but time was endless. Social structures evolved because the same families dealt with each other for generations. "Why don't we leave?" asked Asher's granddaughter, the same question every young person asked. Why stay where food is scarce and water scarcer? Asher led her to the refuge's edge where green gave way to grey death. Scattered bones marked previous attempts to leave. Because scarce is better than none. Because here we know every danger. Out there, danger knows us. The refuge wasn't paradise. Water came from ancient aquifers, jealously guarded. Game was limited. Arabian oryx, gazelles, small prey that required perfect coordination to catch. Plants were seasonal, forcing bands to move in predictable patterns that brought them into repeated contact. Conflict was inevitable when the same groups competed for the same resources generation after generation. But they developed something unprecedented, deep time thinking. When you know your great-grandchildren will walk the same paths, hunt the same territories, you plan differently. Sustainable harvesting wasn't philosophy, it was necessity. Take too much today, and your lineage starves tomorrow. The bands developed intricate rules. This waterhole belonged to these families during this season. That hunting ground was off-limits during breeding time. Violations meant exclusion from the network, and exclusion meant death. Law evolved from survival needs, enforced by communal memory that stretched across generations. Genetic changes swept through the population like wildfire. In larger populations, mutations dilute. Here, in this bottleneck, every advantageous change spread to everyone within generations. 56 major genetic variants emerged during the standstill. Changes to fat metabolism, disease resistance, cognitive function, humanity 2.0, debugged and optimized by isolation. But the psychological pressure was crushing. Imagine knowing every person you'd ever meet, every path you'd ever walk, every meal you'd ever eat. The same stories, the same faces, the same horizons, forever. Madness wasn't uncommon. Suicide rates that would horrify modern societies. The refuge preserved bodies, but tortured minds. They developed coping mechanisms, elaborate rituals that broke monotony, rotating leadership that gave illusions of change, exchange marriages that shuffled genetics and provided novelty. Most importantly, they developed the future tense, complex language structures that let them imagine different tomorrows even when today never changed. One day, Asher told the children, the walking time will return, the grey lands will green, the poison water will clean. We keep the knowledge for that day. The knowledge was everything: how to find water in true desert, how to navigate by stars, how to preserve food for long journeys, how to read weather patterns, skills useless in the refuge but vital for the expansion that must someday come. They were a culture in storage, maintaining abilities they couldn't use. Some bands gave up, stopped teaching the old ways, stopped believing in the walking time. They adapted completely to refuge life, becoming specialists in stasis. These groups thrived in the short term, but carried the seeds of their own extinction. When the world finally opened, they'd lost the ability to explore it. But Asher's lineage and others like them maintained dual cultures: refuge skills for survival, walking skills for hope. Children learned to find water in the Yemen highlands and how to cross desert. They memorized stars they'd never follow and paths they'd never walk. Faith disguised as education. The breakthrough came slowly. Climate improving by degrees. Reports from scout parties venturing further each year. A distant water source that remained clean. A valley where plants grew. Paths through the dead zones that connected to living lands beyond. But expansion brought new challenges. Bands that had coexisted for millennia now competed for who would claim new territories. Young people eager to leave clashed with elders who feared the unknown. The refuge that had preserved them had also shaped them, and not everyone wanted to abandon that shaping. "We are reef people now," one elder argued. "We know every current, every danger. Out there we become prey again." But the young won, as they always do. Slowly, in groups of 10 or 20, they began the second walking. North into Asia, east toward India, west back toward Africa, carrying refuge-forged genes and hard-won knowledge into empty lands. Asher lived to see the first groups leave, but died before knowing if they survived. Her great-great-granddaughter would walk all the way to Australia. Her great-great-grandson would reach Europe. The explosion out of Arabia would fill the world in just 20,000 years, lightning speed after the crawling millennia of standstill. Modern humans carry the refuge in their genes, the 56 variants that mark them as survivors of the bottleneck, the deep time thinking that lets them plan beyond their own lives. The dual nature that can adapt to stasis or expansion as needed. All forged in Arabian caves by people who waited 30,000 years for the world to become possible again. The standstill wasn't just survival, it was metamorphosis. Humanity entered as one thing, African, diverse, expanding. It emerged as another, bottlenecked, refined, explosive. The pause between extinctions that created the humans who would inherit the earth. Asha's bones rest somewhere in Yemen, unmarked and forgotten. But her patience lives in every human who plans for futures they won't see, who maintains knowledge they don't currently need, who survives not through action but through endurance. The Arabian Standstill taught humanity the hardest lesson. Sometimes the greatest journey is going nowhere for 30,000 years, keeping ready for the moment when nowhere becomes everywhere. That moment always comes, for those patient enough to wait, stubborn enough to endure, wise enough to prepare. The walking time always returns. Eventually, Martha Jameson stood in her kitchen in Boise City, Oklahoma, watching the Black Wall approaching from the north. April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday, they'd call it later. But right now, it was just another duster rolling in. Except this one looked like the world ending. "Get the wet sheets!" she screamed to her children, her voice already competing with the rising wind. They knew the drill. Sheets over windows. Wet cloths for breathing. Huddled in the center room. Wait for the black to pass. As dirt turned day to midnight, Martha couldn't know she was reenacting a scene from 74,000 years ago. Different catastrophe, same human response. The Dust Bowl was Toba in miniature, a regional apocalypse that would teach Americans what their ancestors already knew. When the earth turns against you, you adapt or die. The parallels were eerie: darkness at midday, air that killed, water turned poison, crops dead, animals suffocating, communities shattered. But where Toba took 100,000 years of human knowledge to survive, Dust Bowl refugees had advantages. Trucks instead of feet, railroads instead of walking, California instead of nowhere. Still, the human responses were remarkably similar. Martha's Last Man Club in Boise City mirrored the cooperation networks of Toba survivors. Neighbors who'd competed now shared everything: food, water, knowledge, hope. When banks foreclosed on farms, communities rallied to prevent evictions. When children developed dust pneumonia, mothers pooled remedies and care. "We're becoming cave people," her husband John joked grimly, sealing another crack against the omnipresent dust. He wasn't wrong. Dust Bowl survivors developed the same innovations as their ancient ancestors. Masks evolved from simple handkerchiefs to elaborate filters. Sealed rooms became survival shelters. Community knowledge networks spread successful adaptations. The WPA interviewed survivors, capturing oral histories that revealed behavioral patterns unchanged since Toba. Farmers who'd been individualistic became communal. Women created cooperative kitchens and childcare. Children learned to read dust storms like ancient humans read ashfall. Evolution of behavior accelerated by crisis. Dust pneumonia killed hundreds, filling lungs with soil turned to mud. Doctors had no treatment, just like Toba's healers facing ash cough. But communities developed the same solutions: isolation of the sick, herbal remedies that sometimes worked. Above all, the psychological support that kept people fighting. The migration patterns matched too. Just as Toba survivors headed for coasts, Dust Bowl refugees fled to California, Oregon, Washington, anywhere with water and work. Route 66 became a river of human movement, carrying Okies and Arkies away from dead lands toward hope. 3.5 million people relocated, the largest internal migration in American history. But like the Arabian Standstill, some stayed. The Last Man Clubs were groups who vowed to remain until the land recovered or they died, trying. They developed techniques parallel to ancient innovations, new farming methods, crop varieties that could survive. Above all, the stubborn endurance that marked humanity's response to catastrophe. Caroline Henderson, writing her Letters from the Dust Bowl, captured the psychological impact. We are told that we have lost the joy of living, but I wonder if it is not the joy of dying that we have lost. The same existential crisis Toba survivors faced. When tomorrow seems impossible, how do you maintain hope? The answer was community. Dust Bowl survivors created social bonds stronger than pre-disaster connections. Shared suffering became shared strength. The same woman who wouldn't speak to her neighbor over fence disputes now shared her last flower with that neighbor's hungry children. Crisis dissolved artificial boundaries, revealing fundamental human cooperation. Government response added a modern twist. The New Deal's programs, soil conservation, work projects, financial aid, represented community cooperation scaled to national level. FDR's fireside chats served the same function as ancient storytellers, providing hope and shared narrative during dark times. Technology changed, but human needs remained constant. The Dust Bowl's resolution came faster than Toba's. Rain returned, farming adapted, the economy recovered. But the psychological scars lasted generations. Dust Bowl survivors hoarded food decades later. They sealed windows obsessively. They told stories of the black blizzards to grandchildren who couldn't imagine dirt blocking the sun. Modern trauma psychology recognizes these responses as normal adaptation to abnormal circumstances. The same mechanisms that helped humans survive Toba, hypervigilance, resource hoarding, intense social bonding, appeared in Dust Bowl survivors. Evolution had programmed these responses over millions of years. The Dust Bowl just activated ancient software. We thought we were modern people, Martha reflected years later. Had trucks and radios and electric lights when they worked. But when that dusk came, we became our great-great-grandparents real quick. Same fears, same solutions, same hope that tomorrow would be better. The Dust Bowl lasted 8 years. Toba's impacts lasted millennia. But the human response scaled accordingly. Same behaviors, different timeline. Community cooperation, technical innovation, psychological endurance, mass migration, stubborn minorities who refuse to leave. All the patterns laid down in humanity's genes by previous catastrophes. The Last Man Clubs eventually disbanded as rain returned and members died or moved away. But their spirit, the determination to endure when endurance seems impossible, came straight from ancestors who faced volcanic winter and survived. The same bloody-minded refusal to quit that carried humanity through bottlenecks and catastrophes. Martha Jameson lived to see the southern plains green again. Lived to see her grandchildren playing in grass where dust dunes once stood. When they asked about the old photographs showing buried fences and black skies, she'd tell them about neighbors becoming family, about sharing when having nothing to share, about finding hope in hopelessness. We learned we were tougher than we knew, she'd conclude. When everything went wrong, we went right. Together. She was unknowingly echoing words spoken around fires 74,000 years ago. Different language, same truth. Humans survive catastrophe not through individual strength, but collective stubbornness. Not through avoiding disaster, but transforming it into evolution. The Dust Bowl was Toba, compressed, localized, modernized. But underneath the technological differences lay the same human heart that refused to stop beating when the world turned dark. The same cooperation that turned extinction into opportunity. Proof that 74,000 years of evolution hadn't changed the fundamental equation. When the Earth tries to kill you, you grab your neighbor's hand and refuse to die. Together. The spear point was ugly, asymmetrical, poorly balanced, made from inferior stone because good flint was buried under ash. Keo turned it in his hands, ashamed to present such shoddy work to the hunters. Before Toba, his points were art. Now, they were just sharp enough to maybe kill. "It will serve," the lead hunter said, taking the point without complaint. They both knew the truth. Beautiful tools were a luxury the ash world couldn't afford. If it cut, if it flew straight enough, if it lasted one hunt, that was enough. But desperation bred innovation in ways comfort never could. As traditional tool-making materials disappeared under ash or became inaccessible, humans discovered alternatives that would have been unthinkable before. Bone, previously used only for specialized tools, became primary. Antler, wood, even shells were pressed into service. Keo's daughter, watching him struggle with substandard stone, made a suggestion that would have earned ridicule in the before times. Why not mix materials? Stone for the edge, bone for the body, bound with sinew. Composite tools. The idea was radical. Traditional tools were single pieces, their strength coming from unity. But when good materials were scarce, combining different elements made sense. A small piece of quality stone could provide cutting edge, while abundant bone provided structure. The first composite spear was another ugly thing, but it worked better than expected. The bone shaft absorbed impact that would shatter pure stone. The sinew binding provided flexibility. The stone edge could be replaced when dulled without discarding the entire tool. Efficiency through modularity, a concept that wouldn't be formalized for millennia. Word spread through the coastal network. Soon, composite tools appeared everywhere. Hooks combining bone shanks with stone barbs. Harpoons mixing wood, stone, and shell. Each region adapting based on available materials. Innovation through limitation. But the real revolution came from a child's accident. Young Pila, helping her mother prepare hides, dropped a stone scraper in the fire. When they retrieved it, the stone had changed. The coarse surface that had been difficult to work was now smooth, almost glassy. More importantly, when her mother tried to nap it, the stone flaked predictably, creating sharper edges than before. Heat treatment of stone. The discovery spread like the fire that created it. Different stones required different temperatures, different duration. Too hot and they shattered, too cool and nothing changed. But done right, inferior stone became workable. Good stone became excellent. The fire improves stone like it improves meat, Keo observed, experimenting with temperatures. Makes tough things tender. Tools previously impossible with available materials became feasible. Delicate projectile points from grainy stone. Precision cutting implements from previously worthless rock. The ash that had destroyed traditional quarries had forced humans to discover that any stone could become a tool with proper treatment. Hafting, attaching stone tools to handles, underwent similar revolution. Traditional methods used hide glue, pitch, and specific binding patterns. But ash-contaminated pitch wouldn't set properly. Hide glue attracted moisture in the humid coastal environment. Everything that had worked for generations failed. Desperation led to experiment. Tree resin mixed with ash created stronger adhesive than pure pitch. Certain shellfish produced waterproof glue when boiled. Mechanical hafting, using carved sockets and wedges instead of adhesive, proved more reliable than chemical bonds. Each failure taught lessons that success never could. The social structure of tool-making transformed. Before Toba, Master Nappa's guarded techniques jealously, passing secrets only to chosen apprentices. Now, with survival hanging on every innovation, knowledge flowed freely. A technique discovered in one band spread to all within days. The first open-source technology movement, driven by existential need. Tool functions expanded beyond traditional categories. A scraper wasn't just for hides anymore, it became pot maker, fire starter, weapon, digging implement. Versatility mattered more than perfection. The Swiss Army knife mentality emerged from necessity of carrying fewer tools while needing more functions. Micro-tools appeared as materials grew scarcer. Where once a large blade would be discarded when dulled, now tiny flakes were hafted into handles, creating cutting edges from what had been waste. Economy of material pushed miniaturization that would later enable precision work impossible with larger tools. But perhaps the most significant innovation was psychological. Tools had always been extensions of human capability. Now they became symbols of human adaptability. Each ugly, composite, improvised implement declared that humans could create solutions from whatever materials existed. The medium mattered less than the message. We will not be stopped by scarcity. Ko lived to see his granddaughter creating tools he couldn't understand. Multi-component arrows with replaceable elements. Mechanical traps that worked through stored energy rather than human presence. Tools for making tools. A conceptual leap that would define human technology forever. You turned limitation into liberation, he told her, examining a complex fishing device made from 12 different materials. We had stone, so we use stone. You have everything and nothing, so you use imagination. She smiled, already planning improvements. Desperation taught us that the tool isn't the stone or bone or wood. The tool is the human mind solving problems. Everything else is just material. The Ash world had stolen their traditional resources, but given them something more valuable. The knowledge that innovation came not from abundance, but from constraint. Every modern technology would build on this foundation. The understanding that human creativity could transform any material into any tool if the need was desperate enough. When anthropologists later studied Toba-era tools, they marveled at the sudden explosion of innovation. Composite tools, heat treatment, microtechnology, modular design, advances that should have taken millennia compressed into generations. They wondered what pressure could drive such rapid development. The answer was simple: desperation. The mother of invention turned out to be a harsh parent, but an effective teacher. When traditional failed, radical became reasonable. When perfect became impossible, adequate became art. When resources vanished, resourcefulness appeared. The tools of desperation weren't just implements, they were humanity's declaration of independence from material constraints. Proof that the most important tool would always be the human capacity to see solutions where others saw only problems. Ugly, asymmetrical, improvised solutions that cut through catastrophe as cleanly as any perfect blade ever could. The breaking happened at different times for different people. For Lyra, it was the morning she found her youngest daughter trying to eat ash, so hungry she'd forgotten it would kill her. The child's grey-stained lips and vacant eyes showed a mind retreating from unbearable reality. Lyra held her daughter, forced water between cracked lips, and felt something fundamental crack inside herself. "She's gone away," the healer woman diagnosed. "Gone where the hurt can't follow." Mind sickness. The shamans had names for it: soul flight, empty walking, the grey dreaming. Modern psychology would recognize acute stress disorder, PTSD, dissociative episodes. But labels mattered less than the reality. Minds could break as surely as bodies. And in the Ash world, broken minds meant death. Kuda watched his people carefully, learning to read the signs. The 1,000-yard stare that meant someone was retreating inward. The manic energy that preceded collapse. The dangerous calm of those who'd decided to stop fighting. He'd lost 3 adults not to hunger or disease, but to simply giving up, walking into the ash storms, lying down and refusing to rise. The body fights to live, the healer woman explained, but the mind can choose death, and once it chooses, the body follows. They developed interventions through trial and error. Isolation was death. They learned to never leave the mind-sick alone. Routine helped, simple tasks that connected people to reality. The young firekeeper, wise beyond his years, discovered that teaching others his craft pulled them from the grey dreaming. Purpose was medicine. But some minds bent in different directions. Tam, who'd invented the bow, became obsessed with perfection. He'd craft arrows for days without sleeping, destroying any that showed the slightest flaw. His innovation turned to obsession, creativity to compulsion. They had to hide his tools at night to force him to rest. "The ash makes us more ourselves," observed Kuda's daughter. "The careful become paralyzed. The brave become reckless. The sad become lost." Children adapted differently than adults. Those born before Toba carried trauma, nightmares, fear of darkness, anxiety when ash fell heavier. But children born after, they played in ash like snow, made games of finding food, laughed at dangers that terrified their parents. The baseline for normal had shifted so dramatically that misery became mundane. This created generational fractures. Parents who remembered abundance couldn't understand children satisfied with subsistence. Elders who'd known stability were baffled by youth who thrived on constant change. The psychological landscape shifted as dramatically as the physical one. Group dynamics evolved to manage mental health. They developed rituals, not religious but psychological. Evening circles where everyone spoke one good thing from the day. Morning affirmations of survival, shared activities that reinforced group bonds. What modern therapy would call cognitive behavioral interventions developed through desperate necessity. The storytellers became therapists. Their tales weren't just entertainment but psychological medicine. Stories of others who'd survived worse. Heroes who'd found hope in hopelessness. Futures where the ash cleared and children played in green fields. Fiction as treatment for unbearable reality. Music served similar function. The simple drums and flutes became complex during Toba, not from artistic evolution but from psychological need. Rhythm synchronized heartbeats, creating physical calm. Melodies carried emotions too complex for words. Dance exhausted bodies and freed minds. Performance therapy before the concept existed. But the deepest psychological challenge was existential. Why survive when every day brought fresh misery, when the future seemed like endless repetition of suffering? What justified the effort? Different people found different answers, but those who found no answer didn't last. For some, children were enough. The biological imperative to see offspring survive overrode personal despair. For others, curiosity. What would tomorrow bring? Some survived from spite, refusing to let the mountain win. Others from duty to the dead, carrying their memories forward. Kuda found his answer in the group itself. "We survive because we survived," he'd say. "Every day we live proves it's possible. We're the answer to our own question." The social pressure to survive was intense. Suicide was seen not as personal choice, but as abandonment of the group. Those who attempted it were watched, supported, sometimes physically prevented. Not from moral judgment, but practical reality. Every death weakened everyone's chances. They learned to recognize and use positive psychology, celebrating tiny victories, a successful hunt, a clean water source, a day without deaths, creating anticipation, planning for seasonal changes, preparing for eventual recovery, building identity around survival itself. We are the ones who endure. Mental flexibility became a survival trait as crucial as physical health. Those who couldn't adapt their expectations died of disappointment. Those who couldn't find joy in marginalia went mad from misery. Natural selection for psychological resilience. Evolution of the mind under pressure. The healers developed crude but effective treatments, talking circles for trauma, physical exercise for depression, purposeful tasks for anxiety, social integration for isolation. They couldn't cure mental illness, but could manage it enough to maintain function. When the ash finally began to clear, when the first green shoots appeared, the psychological impact was as dramatic as the physical. Some wept uncontrollably. Others refused to believe it. Sure disappointment waited. A few actually grew worse. Their entire identity built around enduring catastrophe now threatened by recovery. "We survived the ash," the healer woman noted. "Now we must survive the healing." Because minds shaped by trauma don't simply revert when circumstances improve. The hypervigilance, resource hoarding, emotional numbing that ensured survival became impediments to thriving. Recovery required its own psychological evolution. The children adapted fastest, as always. But adults carried their mental scars like the physical ones, permanent alterations that marked them as catastrophe survivors. They'd jump at falling leaves that looked like ash, hoard food despite abundance, wake screaming from nightmares of suffocation. Yet they'd also gained strengths, unshakable group bonds, ability to find joy in smallest pleasures, resilience that made normal hardships seem trivial. They'd been psychologically reforged, and if the resulting metal was harder, perhaps less flexible, it was also far stronger. The psychology of survival wasn't just about enduring trauma. It was about transforming trauma into strength, individual suffering into collective resilience. About discovering that minds, like tools, could be composite things, broken pieces bound together into something functional, even beautiful. When their grandchildren asked what the ash time was like, survivors would struggle to explain. How could you describe a darkness that lived inside your head, a weight that pressed on thoughts, a grey that coloured every perception? "We learned what we were," was often the only answer. Not what we thought we were, what we really were. And we were enough. Barely, but enough. The morning came like any other in the grey world. Mira woke to tend the fire, pulled her ashcloth over her face, and stepped outside to check the weather. But something was wrong, different. It took her sleep-fogged mind several heartbeats to understand what she was seeing. Blue. A patch of actual blue sky, no bigger than her outstretched hand, peeked through the ash clouds that had been her ceiling for 3 years. She stood frozen, afraid to blink, afraid to breathe, afraid that any movement might make it disappear. "Papa," she whispered, not trusting her voice to go louder. "Papa, come. Come now." Kuda emerged expecting crisis. Another death, another band fleeing starvation, another impossible choice. Instead, he found his granddaughter pointing at the sky with tears streaming down her face, creating clean tracks through the perpetual ash dust on her cheeks. "Is it real?" she asked, like a child seeking confirmation that monsters weren't hiding under sleeping furs. Within minutes, the entire band had gathered. 63 faces turned skyward, watching that small window of blue like it might hold answers to prayers they'd forgotten how to voice. Children who'd never known anything but grey twilight asked what the strange colour meant. Adults who'd thought they'd never see it again wept openly. "The mountain sleeps," old Naya pronounced. She'd survived to see the end, though her body was a map of all the ways Toba had tried to kill her. Its anger passes, the world remembers how to breathe. But the changes came slowly, irregularly, cruelly raising hopes just to dash them. The blue patch disappeared by midday, swallowed by returning clouds. 3 days later, a bigger hole appeared. Then a week of solid grey. Then an entire morning of patchy sky. The mountain was dying, but dying hard. The first time the sun, the actual sun, not the dim orange ghost they'd grown accustomed to, broke through with real warmth. People didn't know how to react. Some fled to shadows, trained by years that exposure meant death. Others stood transfixed, feeling warmth they'd forgotten existed. The children, always adaptable, immediately began stripping off the layers that had been their second skin. "It burns!" one cried, not in pain but wonder, feeling direct sunlight for the first time in memory. Physical changes accompanied the clearing skies. The constant ashfall that had required daily clearing slowed to weekly dustings, then occasional flurries. Rain, when it came, fell cleaner, still grey-tinged but no longer the caustic poison that had burned skin and killed plants. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the world was slowly exhaling a held breath. But the psychological impact was complex. Some celebrated, dancing in the occasional sunbeams, making plans for when the world returned to normal. Others grew anxious, their entire identity built around surviving catastrophe now threatened by recovery. What were Ash people without Ash? "We can't go back," Kuda's daughter observed, watching her own children play in actual sunlight. "We're not the same people who watched the sky darken. The world isn't the same world." She was right. The landscape emerging from beneath its ash shroud was alien. Forests were gone, replaced by bare earth enriched with volcanic minerals. Rivers ran in different channels, carved by 3 years of ash-weighted floods. Coastlines had changed as sea levels shifted. The map of the world had been redrawn in grey. And the silence. With the constant ashfall ending, they noticed how quiet the world had become. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no rustling of small creatures in undergrowth because there was no undergrowth and no small creatures. They'd grown so used to the absence that its recognition hit like fresh grief. "Will they come back?" a child asked about the animals. "When the plants grow, will the animals remember to return?" Nobody had answers. The world was entering uncharted territory, not the catastrophe itself, but what came after. How long to recover? Would it recover? Or was this lessening just a pause before the mountain woke again? Scouting parties ventured further as air cleared. They returned with mixed news. Vast areas remained dead zones where nothing grew and ash lay feet thick. But they also found pockets where life clung, a spring surrounded by green algae, insects surviving in a protected valley, even a small bird, though none could identify its species. The plant discoveries were most promising. In areas where rain had washed ash into soil rather than letting it accumulate, tiny shoots emerged, not the plants they remembered. Those seeds were buried too deep or killed by toxins, but new things, evolved from whatever had survived. Plants already adapted to ash-rich soil, already selected for traits the new world demanded. "Life is teaching us," the healer woman observed. "It doesn't return, it becomes..." Social structures faced their own evolution. The rigid cooperation required for survival began loosening as immediate death seemed less likely. Bands that had merged from necessity started discussing separation. Hierarchies based on survival skills faced challenges as those skills became less critical. The first major conflict came over territory. With the world opening up, who had rights to the recovering lands? Those who'd sheltered nearest. those who'd scouted them first, those strong enough to take them. The council that had managed Catastrophe faced new challenges in managing recovery. "We share the dying world, but fight over the living one," Kuda said sadly, mediating between two bands claiming the same recovering valley. Perhaps that's human nature, cooperation in crisis, competition in comfort. They developed new rules through painful negotiation. Recovery territories based on sustainable population, not first-come claims. Shared knowledge about what grew where. Rotation systems to prevent overuse of fragile new growth. The habits of scarcity applied to emerging abundance. But individual psychology proved harder to manage. People who'd suppressed grief for years suddenly collapsed as safety allowed emotion. Children who'd been miniature adults struggled with newfound childhood. Couples who'd stayed together for survival discovered they had nothing else in common. The first suicide after the skies began clearing shocked everyone. A young man who'd been a pillar of strength during the worst times, walking into the ocean one clear morning. His partner found a message scratched in ash mud. "I was built for ending, not beginning." Others thrived, energy long suppressed exploding into activity. Construction of permanent shelters, experiments with cultivation, art returning not as psychological necessity but aesthetic choice. The same diversity that had saved them physically now expressed itself culturally. Religious feelings, suppressed by immediate survival needs, resurged. Some saw the clearing skies as divine forgiveness, others as natural cycles. New rituals developed around the returning sun, the cleaner rain, the first green shoots, meaning making for a world remade. But Kuda, now ancient by any measure, watched it all with eyes that had seen too much. The blue sky was beautiful, yes, the returning warmth welcome. But he couldn't forget the lessons written in ash and death. The world could end, had ended, would end again someday. "We must remember," he told the gathered bands on the first truly clear night, stars visible for the first time in 3 years, not the suffering, that will fade, but the knowledge that mountains can explode, that skies can fall, that we can survive even that, but only together. They created monuments then, not grand things, piles of stones, patterns of shells, handprints on protected rock faces, markers that said, "We were here when the world ended, and we remained when it began again." Physical memory for when mental memory faded. The children born after the clearing would grow up in a world their parents couldn't quite believe, where plants grew and animals slowly returned, where the sky was usually blue and rain usually clean, where ash was something you cleaned from old shelters, not your lungs. But they'd also grow up with stories of the time when noon was midnight, when breath was labor, when humans became something harder and stronger than they'd known they could be. Stories that seemed impossible but carried truth in their very telling. The ash had stopped falling, but its lessons continued to settle, layer by layer, into the bedrock of human culture. Preparation for the next catastrophe, appreciation for the quiet times, knowledge that survival was always provisional, always fragile, always dependent on the person standing next to you. The sky was blue, the sun was warm, the world was healing, but the humans who'd survived its ending would never quite trust its promises again. And perhaps that wisdom, that watchful, cautious, cooperative wisdom, was Toba's greatest gift, wrapped in ash and death, but a gift nonetheless. The price of blue skies was remembering they could turn grey. The cost of survival was never forgetting how close they'd come to not. Jarek stood at the edge of what had once been a forest, Now an endless expanse of grey, nothing punctuated by skeleton trees. He'd walked for 7 days looking for other survivors, following rumours of smoke, of voices, of life. But the world was empty in ways that made his chest tight with a loneliness no amount of companions could cure. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed by deadness that went beyond silence. No echo, no bird startled into flight, no rustle of hidden animals, just his words falling into ash like stones into dust. His band had survived. 43 souls clustered around a spring that had stayed mostly clean, but they were alone in ways that numbers couldn't fix. The network of bands that had existed before Toba, hundreds of groups connected by kinship and trade, was gone. Not dead, necessarily, just absent. Scattered to winds that no longer blew. The emptiness was mathematical. Before the mountain's rage, Kuda's grandmother had spoken of gatherings where 500 people would meet for seasonal celebrations. 20 bands, 30, alliances stretching across territories that took moons to walk. Now, their scouts found abandoned camps, cold fires, scattered bones that might be human or animal. Hard to tell when starvation made both look the same. "We found tracks," his daughter reported, returning from her own search. "Maybe 20 people. 3 days old, heading east." 20 people. Once, that would have been a small family group. Now, it represented hope incarnate. Others had survived, were moving, were findable. They prepared immediately, packing what little they had, ready to walk forever if it meant ending the isolation that crushed harder than hunger. Following tracks through ash was an art Jarek had perfected. Reading the subtle depressions, the way ash compressed differently under various weights. Children here, the steps were shorter. An elder, perhaps. One track dragged slightly. Healthy enough to maintain pace. Desperate enough to not cover their trail. 3 days became 5. 5 became 7. The tracks grew fresher, but the band remained ghostly, absent. Always just ahead. Always unreachable, like chasing their own future selves across a landscape that offered no landmarks, no variety, just endless grey beneath slowly clearing skies. When they finally saw smoke, real smoke from real fires made by real humans, Jarek's band stopped. The relief was so intense several people sat down hard, overwhelmed by the simple evidence that they weren't the last. That somewhere in this ash desert, others had found reasons to keep fires burning. The meeting was awkward. 2 bands of strangers who would have been cautious before now faced each other with desperate need, tempered by learned wariness. The other group numbered 31. Together, they'd make 74. Enough for genetic diversity. Enough for specialized skills. Enough to feel human again. "Where from?" Jarek asked. The traditional greeting weighted with new meaning. "Coastwalk." "Tribe," their leader answered. "Maybe others lived. Maybe not." "You." Springhold people. We stayed, many left, never returned. The names meant nothing anymore. Geographic markers for places that might not exist. Tribal identities for tribes that had dissolved. But the ritual of naming provided comfort, connecting them to a world where such things had mattered. Merging wasn't simple. Different bands had developed different survival strategies, different hierarchies, different traumas. Jarek's people had stayed put, becoming specialists in extracting life from one location. The coastwalkers had moved constantly, never depleting one area, never staying long enough to invest emotionally. "You waste resources building permanent shelters," the coastwalker leader argued. "You waste energy constantly moving," Jarek countered. But beneath the practical disagreements lay desperate need for connection. Children who'd had no one to play with suddenly had peers. Adults who'd carried specialized knowledge alone found others who understood. The genetic arithmetic that had grown dangerously narrow suddenly expanded. They stayed together, working through differences because separation meant returning to the emptiness. And in that forced cooperation, something new emerged. Not the organic bonds of traditional kinship, but chosen connection. Strangers becoming family because family was whoever helped you survive. More bands trickled in over months. 8 people here, 15 there. One lone woman who'd walked for a season after her band died of the coughing sickness. Each arrival was celebrated, integrated, treasured. The settlement grew to over 200. Might have been a single gathering before, now represented Metropolis. But for every band that arrived, stories came of 10 that hadn't made it. Entire populations vanished. Languages silenced. Traditions ended. The world wasn't just physically empty, it was culturally hollowed, millennia of accumulated wisdom lost to ash and death. "We're like seeds," the healer woman observed, "scattered far. Most didn't sprout. We few who did must carry everything forward." They began systematic searches, sending groups in every direction with simple missions. Find others, bring them back, or at least bring their stories. These searches would be gone for seasons, returning with handful of survivors or tales of empty lands stretching beyond imagination. One group returned with something extraordinary, children who'd been raised by a band that had retained pre-Toba knowledge. These elders, knowing they were dying, had spent their last years teaching everything to the young. The children arrived carrying songs no one else remembered, stories of the before times, techniques for crafts everyone thought lost. Living libraries, someone whispered, and that's what they became. Each survivor was pumped for knowledge, for memories, for any scrap of the world that was. They recreated what they could, invented what they couldn't, built new culture from fragments of the old. The genetic bottleneck was severe. Maybe 10,000 humans worldwide, scattered in pockets, many still unknown to each other. Every birth was celebrated. Every death mourned not just for the individual, but for the genetic diversity lost. Mate selection became community discussion, balancing preference with population needs. "We're all cousins now," young lovers were told. "Choose wisely." But the empty world offered opportunities too. With competition removed, resources that remained were abundant for the few survivors. Territories that had been jealously guarded were now free for taking. Knowledge hoarded by specialists was shared freely because specialists were too rare to waste. The psychological impact of emptiness was profound. People would walk days to verify another band still existed. Messages were left at traditional gathering spots, even though no one might read them for years. Fire signals were maintained nightly, beacons in the darkness saying, "We're still here," to whoever might see. Children born into the empty world had different perspectives. To them, 200 people was crowds. The idea of thousands gathering seemed mythical. They adapted to isolation as normal, developing patience and self-sufficiency their parents found disturbing. "They don't need others like we do." A mother worried. What happens when they must rebuild? Will they even want to? But rebuild they did, slowly. As the ash settled and plants returned, as animals crept back from whatever refuges had sheltered them, human bands began expanding. Not to previous numbers, that would take millennia. But enough to create networks again, enough to specialize again, enough to dream beyond mere survival. The empty world taught harsh lessons. That civilization was fragile, that human connection was precious, that knowledge could die as easily as people, that starting over was possible but costly beyond measure, That empty could be filled, but never quite the same way. When Jarek died, the settlement had grown to over 500, still tiny by old standards, but feeling like the entire world to those who remembered when 70 seemed miraculous. His last words were recorded, one of the first acts of new writing systems developed to preserve what couldn't be lost again. The world emptied so we could fill it better. We are not many, but we are enough. We are not who we were, but we are who we need to be. The emptiness taught us the value of every voice, every hand, every heart still beating. May we never forget when we were few. May we never waste what we've been given. A second chance. The empty world was filling, slowly, carefully, with humans who knew the weight of absence and the value of presence. It would never be full in the old way again, but perhaps it would be fuller in ways that mattered more. Dr. Chen Li held the DNA results with trembling hands. The conference room in Singapore was silent as 50 of the world's best geneticists stared at the screen showing humanity's family tree. But it wasn't the tree that shocked them, it was how few branches remained. Every person in this room, she said quietly, every human on Earth outside of Africa descends from fewer people than would fill a small high school, maybe 1,000 breeding individuals. That's our ancestry. That's what Toba left us. The year was 2024, but the ghosts of 74,000 years ago haunted every cell in their bodies. The genetic bottleneck wasn't theory anymore. It was written in their chromosomes like a scar that would never heal. Modern humans had less genetic diversity than chimpanzees, than gorillas, than almost any mammal, because they'd come so close to not existing at all. Look at this, Dr. Mohammed Patel projected another slide. Mitochondrial DNA from 100,000 people, all tracing back to maybe 5 maternal lineages that survived Toba. 5 women, probably sisters or cousins, whose children would populate the Earth. The room absorbed this. Scientists who dedicated their lives to understanding human diversity confronted the reality that there wasn't much diversity to study. Every human was cousin to every other human in ways that would horrify any other species. But the ghosts told stories beyond mere numbers. Each genetic marker was a survival tale. The FOXP2 variant that enhanced language abilities spread through the entire surviving population within generations because those who could communicate complex information survived better. The genes for fat storage that helped some populations but caused obesity in others, selected when every calorie might be your last. We carry their solutions in our cells, Dr. Sarah Okafor explained, showing genetic adaptations that emerged during the bottleneck. Lactose tolerance here, altitude adaptation there, disease resistance spreading from a single individual who survived an infection that killed their siblings. We're walking museums of catastrophe management. The most haunting discovery was the echo effect. Genetic variants that should have been diluted or eliminated by normal population dynamics had instead been amplified. One person's random mutation became a third of humanity's inheritance. Tiny populations meant every survivor contributed disproportionately to the future. This individual, Dr. Chen highlighted a genetic sequence, lived approximately 70,000 years ago, had a mutation affecting serotonin regulation. Today, 2 billion people carry it. It's linked to both creativity and depression. One person's neural chemistry became humanity's shared trait. The genetic ghosts weren't all ancient. Interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans showed clearly in the data, but the timing was revealing. Most happened after Toba, when desperate human populations would have welcomed any addition to their shrinking gene pool. The 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in non-African populations wasn't conquest. It was survival mathematics. They saved us, Dr. Patel said bluntly. Neanderthal genes for immune function, blood clotting, metabolism, Denisovan genes for altitude and disease resistance. The other human species were our genetic life rafts. But carrying ghost genes came with costs. Neanderthal variants increase risk of depression, addiction, blood clotting disorders. Denisovan genes that helped at altitude caused problems at sea level. The emergency additions to humanity's genome were like organ transplants, life-saving but requiring permanent management. The bottleneck's effects rippled through time in unexpected ways. Genetic conditions that should be rare were common because they traced to single ancestors in tiny populations. Entire ethnic groups carried recessive disorders that revealed themselves when communities remained isolated. Finland's heritage diseases, Ashkenazi Jewish genetic conditions, French-Canadian founder effects. All echoes of when humanity numbered in thousands, not billions. We're inbred, Dr. Okafor stated what everyone knew, but rarely said aloud. Every human population outside Africa shows signs of extreme founder effects. We're the descendants of survivors, but survivors of a population crash that left us genetically impoverished. The ghost signatures went beyond disease. Personality traits, cognitive abilities, even aesthetic preferences showed founder effects. The genes influencing risk-taking behavior, did they spread because risk-takers survived Toba, or because in tiny populations any trait could become universal through drift? No one could untangle selection from chance when the population was so small. Modern technology revealed more ghosts monthly. Ancient DNA from archaeological sites showed populations appearing and vanishing. Entire lineages that survived Toba only to die out later. Their genes preserved only in trace amounts in modern humans. Ghost populations within ghost populations. Russian dolls of extinction. Homo sapiens almost went extinct at least 3 times, Dr. Chen revealed. Toba was the worst. But genetic data shows other bottlenecks. 150,000 years ago. 100,000 years ago. Each time squeezing us through a smaller needle. We're not just survivors, we're serial survivors. The implications for modern humanity were staggering. Racial categories that seemed distinct were revealed as superficial variations on an extremely narrow theme. The genetic distance between any 2 humans was less than that between neighboring chimpanzee troops. The bottleneck had made mockery of later divisions. We're all family, Doctor, Patel concluded. Not metaphorically, literally. Every human is at most 50th cousin to every other. Most are much closer. The prejudices we carry, the divisions we create, they're arguments between siblings who've forgotten they share grandparents. But the ghosts also carried warnings. Genetic uniformity meant pandemic vulnerability. The same immune systems that had saved the bottleneck survivors were poorly equipped for novel diseases. COVID-19 had demonstrated this. Certain genetic variants that survived Toba made people more vulnerable to new respiratory viruses. Climate change activated other ghost genes. Variants selected for Ice Age survival caused problems in warming worlds. Metabolisms designed for scarcity created obesity in abundance. Stress responses calibrated for immediate physical threats caused anxiety disorders in modern environments. The solutions of 74,000 years ago became the problems of today. We need to understand these ghosts, Dr. Chen urged, not to eliminate them, they're part of what makes us human, but to work with them, to know which ancient solutions need modern management. The genetic ghosts of Toba would never leave humanity. Every baby born carried their markers. Every couple reproducing mixed their inheritances. The bottleneck that had nearly killed the species had also shaped it permanently, creating a humanity unified by shared catastrophe, divided only by recent elaborations on ancient themes. In the conference room, 50 scientists from 50 nations looked at their genetic data and saw the same story. Different recent chapters, but the same opening paragraphs, the same near-death experience, the same desperate survival, the same ghosts haunting every cell. We study human genetics, Dr. Okafor observed quietly, but what we're really studying is a family reunion of catastrophe survivors. Every human alive is here because their ancestors made it through the same needle's eye. We're not diverse populations. We're slightly different expressions of the same survivor's syndrome. The ghosts of Toba lived in their DNA, unkillable, unforgettable. Not curses, but reminders. That survival was never guaranteed. That cooperation beat competition when populations were small. That today's divisions were tomorrow's irrelevancies when faced with extinction. That every human carried inside them the solutions to catastrophes they'd never face, and vulnerabilities to challenges their ancestors never imagined. The genetic ghosts of Toba would haunt humanity forever. But maybe being haunted by survival was better than the alternative, not being here to be haunted at all. Margaret Whitman stood before the Congressional Committee on Climate Preparedness, her silver hair catching the light as she gestured to the presentation behind her. The year was 2025, but she was about to take them back 74,000 years to explain why their great-grandchildren's survival might depend on understanding Toba. Senators, she began, Homo sapiens has survived exactly one global catastrophe, one, and we barely made it. The lessons from that survival aren't ancient history. They're an instruction manual we ignore at our peril. The first slide showed population numbers, 8 billion today, 10,000 after Toba. The visual impact was devastating, a line graph that looked like a heart monitor flatling before struggling back to life. Lesson 1, Whitman continued, civilization is not inevitable. It's not even probable. It's a desperate improvisation by survivors who refuse to quit. Every city, every institution, every technology traces back to people who should have died, but didn't. Senator Rodriguez from Texas shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Whitman, surely modern technology makes us more resilient, not less? Does it? She clicked to the next slide. Supply chains, power grids, just-in-time delivery systems. Toba survivors had one supply chain, what they could carry. When it broke, they improvised. Our supply chains span continents. When they break, we have no backup. We've traded resilience for efficiency. The committee exchanged glances. This wasn't the optimistic assessment they'd expected from the disaster preparedness expert. Lesson 2, Whitman pressed on. Cooperation isn't nice to have. It's the only reason we exist. Genetic evidence shows the surviving bands shared resources even when sharing meant everyone stayed hungry. The bands that hoarded died out. The cooperators populated the earth. She showed archaeological evidence of resource-sharing networks, knowledge exchange between desperate groups, the emergence of collective decision-making. Then she contrasted it with modern nationalism, resource competition, information hoarding between nations facing climate change. We're doing exactly what the extinct bands did, she said quietly. Competing when we should be cooperating, except now there are no other bands to carry forward if we get it wrong. Senator Kim from California leaned forward. You're saying we should model disaster response on Stone Age survivors? I'm saying Stone Age survivors are the only humans who've actually survived global catastrophe. Everyone else is theorizing. They have experience. Whitman's tone was sharp, and their experience says innovation matters less than cooperation, technology matters less than community, and survival is always collective, never individual. She detailed the specific lessons, each one a challenge to modern assumptions. resource sharing networks that assumed scarcity as baseline, not exception. Modern economies assuming endless growth were disasters waiting to happen. Toba survivors knew resources were finite and planned accordingly. Knowledge preservation that assumed systems would fail. Oral traditions, redundant teaching, children learning essential skills by age 7. Modern specialization that left most people helpless without technology was antithetical to survival. Population dispersal that prevented single points of failure. Toba survivors spread widely despite the hardship because concentration meant extinction if local resources failed. Modern urbanization concentrated billions in locations dependent on fragile systems. Psychological resilience built through shared hardship. Toba survivors developed mental health support through community integration. Modern individualism left people psychologically fragile when systems failed. Lesson 3. Whitman showed genetic data. Diversity is strength, but not the diversity we usually mean. Genetic diversity was nearly eliminated. What saved us was diversity of solutions. Different bands trying different strategies. Most failed, but some succeeded, and success spread quickly. She showed how modern monocultures in agriculture, in economics, in technology, recreated the vulnerability of low diversity. Everyone using the same systems meant everyone failed the same way. Toba survivors couldn't afford uniformity. Senator Patel from New York looked skeptical. Dr. Whitman, you're painting a bleak picture. Surely we're more capable than prehistoric humans. Are we? Whitman's question hung in the air. They survived with stone tools and animal skins. Could we survive without electricity, without global transportation, without the 1,000 systems we depend on? They were generalists, we're specialists, in catastrophe which is more valuable. She showed modern preparedness efforts, bunkers for the wealthy, technology fixes that required functioning infrastructure, plans that assumed partial collapse rather than total system failure. Then she contrasted with Toba responses, community integration, skill redundancy, assumption that everything would fail except human cooperation. Lesson 4. Catastrophe doesn't create character, it reveals it. The same populations that shared during plenty shared during scarcity. The same ones that competed during plenty competed during scarcity. But only the sharers survived. Natural selection for cooperation, not competition. The committee was silent now, absorbing implications they hadn't expected from a historical analysis. Lesson 5. Whitman continued relentlessly. Recovery isn't returning to previous state. It's becoming something new. Humans after Toba were psychologically, culturally, even genetically different. They didn't rebuild the old world. They built a new one incorporating catastrophe as expectation, not exception. She showed how modern disaster planning focused on building back better, but still aimed to recreate pre-disaster conditions. Toba survivors had no such luxury. They accepted permanent change and adapted to new normals. Final lesson. Her voice softened. We're all here because someone 74,000 years ago decided that tomorrow was worth fighting for, even when today seemed impossible. They couldn't imagine us, but they carried hope forward anyway. What we do with catastrophe determines not just our survival, but the existence of generations we can't imagine. Senator Thompson from Montana, who'd been quiet throughout, finally spoke. Dr. Whitman, what do you recommend? Practically speaking. Community disaster preparation, not individual. Skill teaching across age groups, not specialization. Resource sharing protocols established before crisis, not during. Psychological resilience through group bonding, not therapy. Assumption that all systems will fail and human cooperation is the only reliability. She paused, looking at each committee member. Senators, Toba taught our ancestors that survival requires becoming different, not just enduring. Climate change is our Toba. The question isn't whether we'll survive. Humans are stubborn. The question is who we'll become in the process. And if we apply these lessons, then maybe we don't need to bottleneck to 10,000 people to learn what they already paid for in death and suffering. Maybe we can skip the near extinction and go straight to the cooperation. Maybe we can be the first humans to face catastrophe with wisdom instead of just stumbling through. The committee sat in uncomfortable silence. They'd wanted reassurance that technology and wealth could protect against catastrophe. Instead, they'd gotten truth. That survival had always been about community, cooperation, and willingness to become what circumstances demanded. The ashes of Toba settled 74,000 years ago, Whitman concluded, but the lessons are still settling. Every human institution, every social structure, every survival strategy traces back to those few thousand who refused to die. We're not studying ancient history. We're studying the only survival manual our species has ever written, and it was written in ash and blood by people who had every reason to quit, but didn't. The question now is whether we'll read that manual or write our own, whether we'll learn from the ashes or create new ones, whether the ghosts of Toba will guide us or merely haunt us as we repeat their near failure with less excuse and more capability. She clicked off the presentation. Thank you for your time. I hope we have enough time left to apply what they taught us. The committee room was silent except for the hum of modern technology that would have seemed like magic to Toba survivors, but magic that required electricity, networks, cooperation, all the things catastrophe destroyed first. Outside, the sky was blue. Inside, 50 people contemplated what color it might be tomorrow, and whether humanity would survive to see it again. The old woman sat by the fire, her great-grandchildren gathered around her like planets orbiting a dying star. The year was 2024, in a small home in rural Oregon, but the scene could have been from 74,000 years ago, elder passing wisdom to young, firelight dancing on eager faces, stories bridging impossible gulfs of time. "Your DNA remembers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime studying what catastrophe does to human souls. Dr. Elena Blackwood, retired anthropologist, grandmother of 6, carrier of genetic ghosts she'd mapped but never quite understood until now. Every time you hoard food despite full cupboards, that's Toba. Every time you feel safer in groups than alone, that's Toba. Every time you share without thinking when someone's in trouble, that's Toba. We're not who we think we are. We're who catastrophe made us. 10-year-old Marcus raised his hand like he was in school. "But Grandma, that was so long ago. Why does it still matter?" Elena smiled, the expression carved by decades of wrestling with exactly that question. "Because, sweet boy, we're not past it. We're products of it. Every human on Earth is here because their ancestors looked at impossible odds and said, not today. We're not normal life. We're what happens when life refuses to lose." She'd spent 40 years studying disaster survivors, modern ones, earthquakes, tsunamis, pandemics, ancient ones, Toba, ice ages, plagues. The patterns were always the same. Humans faced with extinction didn't become heroes or villains. They became human, just more intensely. "Tell us about the scared people," little Aisha requested. It was her favorite part, not the heroes but the terrified ones who survived anyway. "Ah," Elena leaned back. "Everyone was scared. The boy who invented the bow, terrified he'd starve. The woman who discovered tide pools, desperate to feed her children. The bands that cooperated, frightened of facing catastrophe alone. Fear didn't stop them. Fear drove them to solutions courage alone never could have found. She thought of her own life, growing up in poverty, watching her parents share their last food with hungrier neighbors, getting her education through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitations, raising children as a single mother after their father died, drawing on reserves she didn't know existed, small catastrophes that activated ancient programming. We carry their solutions in our cells, she continued. That anxiety you feel, it kept them alive when relaxation meant death. That depression, it conserved energy when action was futile. That hyperactivity, it found food when sitting still meant starvation. We call them disorders now, but they were survival tools then. Marcus frowned. So, we're all broken? No, love. We're all adapted to catastrophe in a world that's temporarily stable, like wearing winter coats in summer. Uncomfortable, but better than being caught without when winter returns. She gestured to the window where evening darkened the sky. Out there, 8 billion people go about their lives thinking civilization is normal. But it's not. It's a brief experiment by catastrophe survivors seeing how long they can maintain stability. Every generation thinks they've escaped the cycle. None have. Will we? Aisha asked quietly. Elena considered lying, telling them technology would save them, that modern humans had transcended their ancestors' vulnerabilities, that progress was permanent. Instead, she told truth, tempered with hope. You'll face your own Toba, maybe climate change, maybe something we can't imagine, but you'll face it with advantages. You know, cooperation beats competition. You have thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. You understand that survival requires becoming different, not just enduring. She pulled out a photo, the Toba super eruption site, now a placid lake. This killed 90% of humanity. The survivors didn't have science, satellites, or global communication. They had each other. That was enough. You have so much more. But we're soft, Marcus protested. We don't know how to make tools or find food or... Stop. Eleanor's voice was firm. Soft is what they called your grandfather when he was young. Filipino immigrant, spoke broken English, cleaned offices. When the earthquake hit in '89, he organized the entire neighborhood. Soft became steel because it needed to. You carry the same transformation potential. She thought of her students over the years, comfortable middle-class kids who discovered depths during crisis, the girl who became a disaster relief coordinator after surviving Hurricane Katrina, the boy who invented water purification systems after seeing his community poisoned. Catastrophe didn't create character. It revealed character that was always there, waiting. We are all children of catastrophe, she said slowly. Not victims of it, children of it, born from it, shaped by it, carrying its lessons in every cell. When people say humans are destructive, remember, we're also the species that refuses to be destroyed. When they say we're selfish, remember, we survived through sharing. When they say we're doomed, remember, they said that 74,000 years ago too. Aisha climbed into her lap. I'm scared of bad things happening. Good. Fear keeps you prepared, but remember what fear is for. Not paralysis, but action. Not isolation, but seeking others. Not giving up, but finding ways. Your ancestors were scared too. They used fear as fuel. You can too. The fire crackled, an echo of countless fires that had held back darkness for desperate humans. In cities around the world, 8 billion descendants of catastrophe went about their lives. Most unaware they were miracles of persistence, each one carrying genetic memories of near extinction, each one potentially facing their own. Last story, Elena said, feeling her years. There was a young mother at Toba who saved her children by inventing new ways to find water. She thought she was just trying to survive another day. She couldn't know that her children would have children who would have children who would someday walk on the moon. Every solution echoes forward. Every survival multiplies. Every child who lives carries possibility forward. Like us? Marcus asked. Exactly like you. You're not just living your own lives. You're carrying forward the accumulated stubbornness of thousands of generations who refuse to quit. When your time comes, and it will come, remember that you're made of catastrophe survivors. It's not just in your history, it's in your cells, in your reactions, in your irrepressible hope, despite evidence suggesting despair. The children were quiet, processing weights too heavy for their years but necessary for their futures. Outside, the modern world hummed with its illusions of permanence. Inside, an old woman passed on truths older than civilization. We are the children of catastrophe, she repeated. All of us, every human alive. We exist because someone looked at impossible odds and tried anyway. Because someone shared when keeping would have been safer, because someone believed tomorrow was worth reaching even when today seemed like ending. And that's why we'll survive, Aisha asked hopefully. That's why we might, Elena corrected gently. If we remember who we are, if we act like the children of catastrophe we are, cooperative, innovative, stubborn beyond reason, if we face our challenges together instead of alone, if we're willing to become different to become survivors. The fire burned lower, the children grew sleepy. But the stories had been told, the wisdom transferred. Another generation knew they were miracles of persistence. Another set of catastrophe's children understood their inheritance. Elena tucked them into bed, each one carrying forward 74,000 years of refusal to quit. Each one a living testament that sometimes the impossible happens, that sometimes the few become many, that sometimes catastrophe creates exactly what's needed to survive catastrophe. Sweet dreams, she whispered, knowing their dreams would be haunted by ash and hope in equal measure, as they should be, as all human dreams had been since Toba taught us that endings could be beginnings if you were stubborn enough to survive the transition. They were the children of catastrophe, all of them, all of us. And tomorrow, like every tomorrow, since the ash fell, they would prove it again. The story never ended. It just found new chapters to write in the endless book of human persistence. Toba tried to close that book. It remained open, page after page, filled with the impossible made inevitable by people who didn't know how to quit. The children slept, carrying forward the flame, as children of catastrophe always had, as they always would, until the last fire went out, which would be never if humans had anything to say about it, and they always did.